Today's story is about a crime so horrific that a judge handed down a sentence that had never been given before in Australian history. This story is exceptionally graphic. As such, viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to spray the like button's face with sunscreen, but instead use bear spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Before we get into today's story, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Honey. Are you tired of paying full price for your bear spray? Me too. That's why I started using Honey. Honey, like bear spray, is one of those things that you don't realize you need until you have it. Then you're like, how did I ever live without this thing? Honey, which is completely free, automatically scours the internet for discount codes and coupons for nearly anything you happen to be shopping for online. It's genius. Use Honey, save money. And just think, with all that honey money you're going to be saving, you can finally upgrade from bear spray to dinosaur spray. So if you want to be like me and continue to bring the good fight to the like button, go ahead and add Honey for free to your browser by going to joinhoney.com/ballin. Okay, let's get into today's story. In 1955, Catherine Knight had the misfortune of being born into a highly dysfunctional and abusive household. Not only was she badly mistreated by her alcoholic parents and cruel older siblings, she was also scorned by the people who lived in the town with her simply because they didn't like her family. Catherine lived in a very small town in New South Wales, Australia, where basically everybody knew each other's business. But despite the abuse, Catherine always tried to focus on the future. She would tell herself that as much as my life is miserable right now, in the future I will have a family of my own and I will take care of them the way I wish my family had taken care of me. But when Catherine became a young woman and began dating men, all of her relationships would always crash and burn because inevitably she and her partner would become toxic and abusive and it would end the relationship. It was like Catherine both didn't know how to be a quality partner and didn't know how to identify a quality partner, likely because she didn't know what that looked like. She had been raised in this horrible household. But in 1995, when Catherine was 40 and really starting to feel desperate for someone to actually love and to love her back, she would meet a man named John Price, who was also 40, and he just seemed fundamentally different than every other man she had ever dated. He was empathetic to her troubled past, and he seemed to really care for her and really wanted to kind of take her under his wing and love her. And so immediately Catherine just fell head over heels in love with John, and in return it seemed very much like John had fallen head over heels in love with Catherine. That year, Catherine moved in to John's house where he lived with his 3 young daughters, who right away took a liking to her. And so for the first time, Catherine felt like her life was really going the way she wanted it to go. But unfortunately, this would not last. Despite the seemingly perfect start to Catherine and John's relationship, it eventually began to sour when Catherine began to ask John if they were ever going to get married. Catherine really wanted to get married. She wanted to kind of officially have a family of her own that she could take care of, but John was weary of marriage because he had just left a failed marriage, and he told Catherine that realistically, he might never want to get married again. And so over time, this issue really drove the two apart, and it all came to a head in early February of 2000 when John and Catherine were at his house. They were in the kitchen, and they got into a heated fight over marriage, and then before long, they were both getting physical with each other. And during this altercation, Catherine kind of scrambled and grabbed a knife on the counter and actually slashed John across the chest. And as soon as she did this, the fight came to an end. John screamed at her to leave the apartment and never come back, but Catherine was already storming out of the apartment. They both understood that a line had been crossed, and almost certainly their relationship was now over. But over the following days and weeks, Catherine, who had moved into a different apartment at this time, kind of near where John was living, she felt very lonely, and even though she knew her relationship with John was not a healthy one, she longed to patch things up with him. She didn't like being alone. She wanted to have that family. And so she decided she would do what she had previously done in other relationships to kind of patch up the relationship after a fight. And so the way she would do this is she would kind of make sure they had the house to themselves, and then she would show up in lingerie and they would have kind of an intimate makeup moment, and then everything would go back to normal. So on February 29th, Catherine waited until she knew John had left for work, and she went over to his place, and she had a key to it still, and she went inside and his 3 daughters were there. And so Catherine said hello and she chatted with the kids for a minute, and then she made arrangements for the 3 kids to go get picked up by a babysitter and spend the night outside of the house. And so then when the babysitter came by the house and picked up the 3 girls, Catherine said goodbye to them, and then Catherine left John's place and she went out to get her lingerie. Later in the evening, when John came back to his house, he went inside and he found his kids weren't there, but there was a note from Catherine that explained where his kids were and how she wanted to make up with him and she would be back in a little while. Now, John was not happy about this. He was angry that she had decided to just come into his house without asking him. That felt very violating. And then also she made a decision about his kids without talking to him. That just felt so offensive and wrong of her to do. And so John grabs a beer out of the fridge, he sits down in the living room, and he begins to wait for Catherine to show up. The next morning at 6 a.m., John was supposed to be at work already, but he wasn't. And so his company, who knew he was very reliable, were concerned something was wrong. And so they sent a worker to his property to see what was going on. And so the worker, he pulls up in front of John's house. John's car is in the driveway. And so the worker's first thought is, oh, I guess John must have overslept. And so the worker walks up onto John's front porch and he knocks on John's front door, but there's no answer. And so the worker knocks again, still no answer. And so this guy turns around to leave and go back and tell the company, look, I don't know what's going on. But as he's turning around, he notices on the very bottom of the outside of the door, kind of near the edge, the front edge of this door, there looked to be some blood on the outside of the door. It was pretty easy to tell it was blood. And so the worker was immediately very concerned and he knocked again on the door, but no answer. And so he ran around to the side of the building and he began banging on the windows of John's house to hopefully rouse whoever was in there to come out and to make sure things were okay, but there was silence. And so the worker ran back to his car, he drove back to his office, and after he told his boss what he had found, they decided they had to call the police. The police would show up at John's residence at 8 a.m., and when they got there, John's vehicle was still in the driveway, the house was quiet and dark, and so the police, they walked up to the front door, they knocked on the door, there's no answer, it's silence, and so they walk around to the back of the property to try the back door, and as they're walking into the backyard, they see in the middle of the grass, right behind a window that led into the house, there was this plate of food that had been clearly thrown out of the house and landed face down on the grass. And so the police see that, they're thinking that's pretty weird. And so what they do first, before even going to the back door, is they turn to the window, which clearly the food had been thrown out of, but whoever had done it had then shut the window. And so they go over to the glass and press their faces up against it and peer inside. And there's no John, there's no people, there's nothing inside, it's dark. But right inside of this window is this big dining room table, and it's covered with this amazing spread of food. It looks like a Thanksgiving Day meal had been prepared, but then no one had eaten from it. And so they're thinking, okay, well, for whatever reason, one of these plates of food was thrown out the window. That's very odd. And so the police come off the window, they walk over to the back door, they knock a few more times, but after even more silence, they kick the back door down and they go inside. As soon as they step in, there's 2 officers. They walk straight into the house with the dining room table with all that food on their left, and there's nothing that stands out. They're calling for John, it's silent, everything is off, everything is quiet, and they keep on walking into what appears to be the living room where the TV is and where there's a couch, and as soon as they walk in, they see there's blood everywhere. And towards the front of the living room, where the front door actually opened into the house, there was a very obvious pool of blood. Basically, if you stepped into the house, you'd be stepping into this puddle of blood. And as they're looking at this pool of blood, they see there is a distinct blood trail from the pool back into the living room that they have just walked into, and the trail kind of leads behind a couch out of their view. And so they walk around the couch to see what's at the end of this trail, and they find Catherine Knight's crumpled body on the ground. And so right away they rush over to her and they feel for a pulse, and they discover that she actually does have a pulse, but very obviously she's clinging to life, barely. And so one of the officers stays with Catherine while they're calling in paramedics to come in and deal with her, while the other officer draws their weapon and they begin searching the rest of the house. And so the officer walks past the front door on their left, left and they go into the other side of the first floor, which is basically like this lounge room, kind of like a secondary living room. And as they're looking out across this room, they see there's no one in it, but there appears to be this curtain blocking the entrance to some other side room. And this officer, as they're looking at it, they look down and they notice there's another blood trail that starts from the front of the house. It snakes all the way across this lounge room and kind of disappears into this covered up room. And so this officer yells out for John, but there's no answer. And so he ends up going all the way across, checking as he's going, looking around, but there's no one there. And he gets to this towel, and with his non-shooting hand, he kind of pushes it out of the way, and he looks inside of this space. And it turns out to just be a small closet. There was nothing of note inside. It didn't really make sense that the blood trail had led to this closet. But then, as the officer is kind of wondering why the blood trail ended here, he started to feel something cold on his non-shooting arm. And so he looked down at his arm and he saw there was this huge streak of blood on his arm. And he knew he had not been wounded in some way. This was not his blood. So how did he get blood all over him? And then he stepped back in horror because he realized the curtain that he had just moved with the arm that had blood on it was not a curtain. The night before, John sat in his living room waiting for Catherine to return, very angrily waiting for her to come back. But by 11 p.m., she hadn't. And John, he works super early in the morning. He's very tired. He decides to just go to bed. And so he climbs into bed. He falls asleep. And then about an hour or so later, Catherine would walk into the bedroom. She had her black lingerie on that she had bought earlier in the day. And even though John was furious with her and very upset with what she had done that day, seeing her like this suddenly made him think, you know what, all my issues with her can wait. And before long, they were getting intimate together in the bed, and then they fell asleep in each other's arms. Later in the night, Catherine would wake up. John's still fast asleep, so she's looking right at him, and she suddenly has this intense sense of disgust. She was convinced that he was taking advantage of her, that the reason he didn't want to marry her was he was just kind of using her. And this anger inside of her boiled up, and she decided right then and there that I need to teach this man a lesson he will never forget. And so Catherine very quietly slipped out of the bed. John's still sleeping. She snuck out of the bedroom. She made her way out of the house, and she got into her car, and she drove across town to the apartment she had been staying in for the past couple of weeks, and she grabbed her work tools. Catherine, where she worked full-time, was a meat processing factory, and she worked on the kill floor with the animals that are being turned into meat. And so her skill set was butchering, and her tools were butcher's knives. And so she grabs her kit of butcher's knives and she drives back to John's place. She goes into the house, she makes her way into the kitchen, and she unrolls this kit full of different sized butcher knives, and she picks the one she wants, she pulls it out, she makes sure it's nice and sharp, and then she made her way into John's bedroom. When she got into his bedroom, John was still asleep. He was lying on his back, covers up over him, fast asleep, and she climbed onto the bed, being very careful not to wake him. And then when she was straddling him kind of on her knees right over his midsection, she raised the knife up between her two hands and she brought it down into his chest. John immediately shot up, bucking Catherine off of him. She went flying onto the floor, and then instinctively John just begins running out of his bedroom. He has no idea what's happening. He's been stabbed, but he probably can't even feel it. It's all adrenaline. He is just running through the house. But by the time he gets to the front of the house, the blood loss had caused him to be so weak he could barely stand. And so he managed to open the front door, but then he collapsed onto the ground halfway between the inside and outside of the house. And so laying there, he reached out with his bloody hand and he grabbed the edge of the door that was partially open and tried to pull himself out of the house. And that's how that bloody print was left on the outside of the door that the worker saw. And as he's trying to pull himself out of the house, Catherine, who had gotten up after being knocked off the bed, she ran to the front of the house and she grabbed his legs and she pulled him back into the house and then shut the door. And then once he was inside, she got on top of him and stabbed him an additional 36 times all over his body. And then she left him there to bleed to death. And so while he's dying, she goes into the kitchen and she puts on a large pot of water to boil. And then she began setting the plates all around the dining room table for a big family meal. After she was done setting the table, she went back over to John, who was now deceased at this point, and she dragged him all the way across that lounge room on the other side of the house that the officer walked through and then found that curtain. She dragged him all the way across that room to right in front of that closet, and then using her expert skills from working in the meat factory, she proceeded to skin John from his neck all the way down to his toe. And she was so good at it that she was able to skin him in one piece. And she took this skin suit and she draped it over the entrance to this closet. And then she removed John's head from the now skinned torso, and she placed it in the water that she had put on to boil earlier. She was going to use his head to turn it into some sort of broth or gravy. And then she grabbed his skinned torso and dragged it into the kitchen and began butchering it and then making different dishes with his meat, different pies and casseroles. And then after she had made this enormous feast out of John's body, she set the food all around the table that she had already laid out, and then she made little placards, little name cards that had the names of each of John's children on them, and she placed them in front of each of the plates because her intention was to feed them their father. And then Catherine sat down at a plate that she had made for herself, and she began eating John, except it made her sick, and so she opened the window behind her and she threw her plate of food out into the backyard. And then when she turned back around and looked at what she had done, she decided that instead of facing the consequences, she would just take her own life. And so she went into the bathroom, she grabbed some sleeping pills, and then she cut across the front of the house, walking through that pool of blood near the door. She made her way into the living room, she overdosed on sleeping pills, and collapsed on the ground. However, when the paramedics finally showed up the following morning, they were able to save her. And so once she stabilized in the hospital, she was promptly arrested for John's murder. She would ultimately be found guilty. However, she would never take any responsibility. And then during her sentencing phase, she was given life in prison, but the judge made a special clause just for her. He told them that her file needed to be stamped, literally stamped, never to be released. Basically, there was no hope ever of her getting out of prison. And so after she was taken away, she would become the first woman in Australian history to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She's still alive today. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to spray the like button's face with sunscreen, but instead use bear spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast that puts out weekly brand new content that you can only get on the podcast. It's called the MrBallen's Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, and it's available on Spotify, iTunes, Apple, Amazon, basically anywhere you get a podcast, that's where you'll find it. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me and then message me on any major social media platform. My username for all of them is MrBallen, and I really do read the bulk of my direct messages. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen's Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page that puts out near daily content. It's just called MrBallen. We also have a Snapchat channel that puts out episodes on Sundays. We have some very cool merch. Go over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. If you have a story suggestion, please drop it in our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, Snapchat, podcasts, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. One evening in April of 2006, a person sat at their kitchen table frantically cutting up the page of a newspaper with some scissors. They were working on a very important project, and it was almost done. They finished cutting up the final letter from the page and pasted it onto the sheet of paper. Then they leaned back to read the message that they'd assembled from the scraps. It was a warning, and they were sure it would have exactly the effect they were hoping for. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please rent a huge billboard on the side of the highway and just put a bunch of embarrassing photos of the like button on it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Sunday afternoon, March 12, 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zamiti Jr. drove his ATV across a frozen lake in Freedom, New Hampshire. And even though it was really cold and the air burned his cheeks and his lungs, Mike smiled as he drove. He really just loved it here. Most of the time, Mike lived 2 hours away in the town of Wakefield, Massachusetts. But he'd been coming to Freedom, New Hampshire for years because his parents had a vacation house here. And so this tiny lakeside community had always felt like a second home and a peaceful retreat. And Mike had recently bought his own vacation house in Freedom just down the street from his parents. And the purchase had been a really big deal for him. He ran a cement contracting company called Allstate Concrete Pumping, and he'd worked really hard for many years to build up a nice life for his wife Michelle and their 3 kids. And in many ways, the purchase of the second house was proof that he'd done it. But his work with the concrete company had also created some issues in his marriage. Being in charge of a company meant a lot of responsibility and long hours. So Michelle and the kids were on their own quite a bit, which meant Michelle had to do most of the parenting and most of the household stuff. And she'd recently made it clear that Mike being gone all the time, despite how successful he was still really hard on her. Now, out on the lake, as Mike was kind of thinking about his whole life, Mike could see another ATV coming toward him. And as it got closer, he could see that the driver of the ATV was the other problem in his marriage, Sean Fitzpatrick. So Sean was one of their neighbors on the lake, and he'd been a close friend of the family for years. He was retired, and he lived in Freedom year-round, and when the Zamitis were there, he'd come over for dinners or barbecues or to take their kids boating out on the lake. He was around so much that Mike's kids actually called him Uncle Sean. But last summer, Mike had found out that his wife Michelle had cheated on him with Sean. Mike had been obviously completely devastated, but he and Michelle had both agreed not to give up on their marriage and had been going to therapy together ever since. And in terms of Mike and Sean's relationship, well, Mike still hadn't actually spoken to Sean since finding out about the affair, because mostly he just hated confrontation. It had been easier for him to avoid Sean and focus on rebuilding his relationship with Michelle. So seeing Sean now made Mike want to just turn around and speed off in the other direction. But Mike could see that Sean was already waving him down, so he came to a stop and waited there as Sean pulled his ATV up. And Sean did not beat around the bush. He immediately told Mike that he was glad he ran into him here because he'd been wanting to apologize about last summer and Michelle. It obviously wasn't okay, and he hoped they could just, put it behind them. And Mike, he was so surprised by how sincere Sean was being that he just said, you know what, that's all good. Which he didn't mean, because it definitely was not okay. But again, Mike's not a confrontational guy. All Mike really wanted to do here was get out of this interaction and get away from Sean, because this made him really uncomfortable. And also, he genuinely did need to leave basically right now, because he and Michelle and the kids were getting ready to head back to Wakefield soon, and he wanted to go help Michelle pack up. And so pretty quickly, Mike told Sean that he really had to go here. And then before, Sean could protest, Mike turned his ATV around and he gunned it back across the lake towards his house. About 15 minutes later, Mike walked into his house, and the first thing he saw was a bunch of suitcases all packed and sitting by the door. And he realized that, Michelle had already done all the work. But seconds later, Michelle came in and gave Mike a kiss. And she said, the kids were just finishing up cleaning their rooms and they could all head out in a few minutes. And then Mike heard the sound of a car beeping twice outside. And when he and his wife heard that, Michelle kind of rolled her eyes and laughed, because they both knew it was clearly Mike's parents. His parents had also been in Freedom for this weekend at their house down the street, and they were also making the 2-hour drive back to Wakefield this afternoon. And Michelle was laughing because it amused her that neither Mike nor his father could manage to go a single day without talking to each other. So Mike's dad was also named Michael, and the name was not the only thing they shared. They were also best friends and co-workers. Michael Sr. owned the company that Mike ran, Allstate Concrete. So it was like a family operation, and Mike Jr. had never even thought of doing anything else. He jumped into the concrete business right out of high school, and he and his dad had been working together ever since. Now, the Allstate Concrete Company had had some struggles, just like any company would, including a lawsuit from a former employee that had been pretty stressful. But for the most part, the business was a huge success, and right now they were busier than ever, working on an enormous construction project in nearby Boston. So Mike headed outside to say hi to his parents and to talk a little business with his dad. He asked Mike Sr. if he'd called their employee, Chester Roberts, yet, because Mike and his dad had plans to be at the office first thing tomorrow morning, and Mike wanted Chester to be there too. Chester worked part-time for them as a driver and also handyman, and he was easily the most reliable employee that they had. So whenever they had a packed week ahead, they always called Chester in. And to Mike Jr.'s relief, Mike Sr. said yes, he'd already spoken to Chester, and they were good to go. So eventually, they all said their goodbyes, and Mike Jr. told his dad he would see him tomorrow. Just before 8 a.m. the next morning, Monday, March 13th, Mike Jr. pulled his truck into the parking lot of Allstate Concrete. He was right on time. He could see he was the first vehicle there, so he got out and hustled across the lot because it was raining, and he unlocked a side door by one of the garage doors. So the Allstate building was basically just a massive garage with 3 huge roll-up doors for their cement trucks to pull into. But it also had an upstairs office where Mike and his father did all their administrative work. And so after Mike went in through the side door into the big garage, he headed up a set of steps that led to his office on the second level. And when he got there, he sat in his desk chair and started going over the week's logistics. And just a few minutes later, he heard another vehicle pull into the lot outside. Mike figured that very likely this was his father, because Chester often came to the office on foot. Then Mike Jr. heard the downstairs door open and footsteps coming up the stairs. A few minutes later, Mike's father, Mike Sr., pulled his truck into the Allstate Concrete parking lot and parked next to his son's truck. He hopped out and walked quickly to the building's side door to get out of the rain, but when he tried to push open the side door, it got stuck on something and wouldn't open all the way. So he looked through the crack to see what was blocking the door, and he froze, because there was clearly a man lying face down inside of the building in a huge pool of blood. Now, it was dark inside the building, and so Michael Sr. could not see the man's face. He had no idea who this guy was. But whoever it was, he knew sort of instinctively that it was not his son. Mike Jr. was a big guy, and even in the dark, it was clear this man had a different build. And so Michael Sr.'s heart was pounding now, and all he could think to do was just back away, grab his cell phone, and call 911. However, after Michael Sr. got off the phone with the dispatcher and they said they were sending people over now, Mike Sr. realized he couldn't just wait for the police to get there. I mean, there was clearly someone either very badly hurt or dead in his garage, and his son was likely somewhere inside too. I mean, his truck was here. And so he had to go in and make sure his son was okay. So Michael Sr. walked away from the blocked door where he had been standing when he called the police, and he pulled up one of the big roll-up garage doors. And once it was open, he didn't see anyone. He just ran inside and began frantically screaming his son's name. But Mike Jr. didn't answer, and there was no sign of him anywhere. So eventually, Mike Sr. ran to the staircase and went up to the second floor office. And as soon as Mike Sr. barged into the office, he stopped in horror, because there, sitting slumped in the desk chair, was the blood-covered body of his son. Over an hour later, Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker pulled up in front of Allstate Concrete. He could see the large building was already roped off with caution tape, and there were a dozen or more crime scene techs and officers with the Wakefield Police Department who were moving in and out of an open garage door collecting evidence. So Baker was not a part of the Wakefield Police Department. He was with the state police. But in Massachusetts, state troopers conduct homicide investigations right alongside local authorities. And Baker had a feeling that this case would definitely need his help, because Wakefield, they didn't get many homicides. The town was about 10 miles north of Boston and had a reputation as being a really peaceful and safe place, the kind of small town where everyone actually knew each other. Baker got out of his cruiser and looked around for whoever was in charge. And he didn't have to wait long, because an officer hurried up to him and introduced himself as Detective Richard Cass with the Wakefield Police Department. Cass told Baker to follow him, and as they walked towards the open garage door, he quickly briefed Baker up on the situation. There were 2 male victims inside, and both were deceased. They'd both been shot, and they had been found by the company's owner, Michael Zametti Sr., a little after 8 a.m. Baker followed Cass into the garage and over to the first body, which was face down on the floor just inside a smaller side door. Cass explained that this victim was 51-year-old Chester Roberts, a part-time truck driver for Allstate. It hadn't been difficult to identify him because Chester did a lot of handiwork around town and was known by all the locals, including Detective Cass himself. When Baker went to the body, he could tell right away that Chester had been shot in the back. It was a single shot, and most likely was from a shotgun, since clearly there was a blast radius where there was like a spray effect with a lot of little pellets that entered his body. Chester had no other visible injuries, including no defensive injuries. And when Baker stood and looked around the garage, He also didn't see anything that pointed to a robbery or any kind of struggle. There was pretty pricey looking equipment just sitting around, and nothing was toppled over or obviously out of place. So Baker guessed that Chester's killer had likely snuck up on him and shot him in the back before he even had a chance to turn around. Baker spent a couple more minutes looking around at the doors and the windows, and again, didn't see any signs of, forced entry or anything out of the ordinary, but that didn't mean much. Chester had likely opened up for the day and begun work, and the killer had just come in after him. And so after a few minutes, when Baker was done looking around the first floor, he told Cass he was ready to go up to the second floor to see the second body. Moments later, Cass led Baker into the second floor office, where the body of 39-year-old Mike Zimetti Jr. had been found. Detective Cass said sadly that, just like with Chester, he knew Mike personally as well. Mike Jr. had not just been shot in the torso the way Chester had been shot. He had been shot in the face as well as in the chest. And the force of these shots had been so powerful that, like his desk and surrounding paperwork were also all drenched in blood. And for the most part, Mike was basically unrecognizable. But what struck Baker the most was not just how gruesome this was. It was the fact that, Mike Jr. is still kind of slumped in his chair. He's in his office. Whoever did this, it's like they went in here to execute Mike, really intentionally. They marched in here, they didn't touch anything else, and they shot Mike right in the face with a shotgun before Mike could even get up. I mean, this seemed very intentional. Somebody came here to kill Mike. And so as Baker was thinking about that, he realized that this likely meant Mike Jr. was the one who actually got shot first, before Chester had even arrived at the building. Otherwise, Mike Jr. would have heard the gunshot downstairs, and he wouldn't have been so caught off guard sitting in his chair like this. And so again, if Mike was the first person shot, it just further suggested that he was the main target of this attack. The crime scene, of course was gruesome, but considering it was remarkably clean. I mean, there were no bloody footprints or any indication the killer had interacted with the scene. And the Zimettis did fit the mafia stereotype, an Italian-American family involved in construction. Baker told Cass what he was thinking, sort of as he was surveying the scene here. And Cass, as he heard this, he sort of had this thoughtful look come over his face. He said he knew the Zimettis pretty well, and Mike Jr. and his father were really good people. So he found it hard to believe they were involved in any kind of shady, mafia business deals. But he conceded that it was possible, especially since the Zimettis were contractors on a project called The Big Dig. And this made Baker immediately raise his eyebrows. So The Big Dig was literally the biggest construction project in the country and involved building a tunnel under the harbor in Boston. But it had been kind of like a total disaster, just a major headache for the city since it was way over budget and had been going on for 15 years and still wasn't done. This huge project had also been famously hampered by mafia dealings and corrupt payoffs. So now Baker had to wonder if the Zimettis had either been involved in these seedy deals or had maybe accidentally upset the wrong person while on the job. But even if the murders had nothing to do with the mob, Baker still thought it was very likely that the killer was somehow connected to their business. Somebody who maybe had worked at Allstate Concrete, or maybe who had been a client, and would know where Mike worked in the building, and that he'd be there early in the morning. And while the second victim, Chester, was probably not the primary target, Baker wasn't sure yet why he was also killed. He could have been killed because he was just at work at the wrong moment, or maybe he was wrapped up in the same conflict as the Zimettis. So for a moment, Baker just stood there staring at the scene, staring at the blood-soaked paperwork all over the desk. And then eventually he turned to Cass and said they would need a list of all of Allstate's employees and clients. Baker then spent some more time just kind of walking around the office looking for evidence, and he noticed a 16-gauge shotgun shell on the floor. So he grabbed a nearby tech and told her to bag it and see if she could locate any other shells. Baker and Cass then headed outside, where already a crowd of people were gathering outside around the outside of the police perimeter. Once they were outside, Trooper Baker asked Cass if they could start by speaking with the person who actually discovered the bodies, Michael Zimetti Sr. But Detective Cass shook his head and said no. He explained when he'd first gotten to the scene that Michael Sr. had been so distraught over his son's death that he could barely speak, so Cass had just sent him home. Another Wakefield police officer had done the same thing when Mike Jr.'s wife, Michelle Zametti, showed up, totally hysterical, saying she had heard there was an accident. And they had told her that her husband was dead and taken her home too. Baker understood, but was not thrilled to hear this. He preferred to speak to witnesses and family really quickly and in person. In a murder, a spouse is always a suspect, so he was especially disappointed to have missed Michelle. But there was still plenty to do at the scene, and obviously the Wakefield police knew where the family could be found later. So Baker turned to Cass and suggested they just start canvassing the businesses nearby. The following morning, March 14th, Trooper Baker parked his car in front of Mike's parents' house in Wakefield. He was with Detective Cass, and they were there to speak with Mike Sr. They'd just gotten the autopsies back for both Chester and Mike, but they didn't reveal anything that they didn't already know. Chester had been shot once, Mike twice, and both died likely within seconds. But the investigators did have one potential lead from their canvass of the neighborhood. Even though they hadn't found any surveillance cameras at Allstate Concrete, some businesses around Allstate had some. So Baker had some officers scrubbing through that footage now. He also had another team interviewing Chester Roberts' family, because there was still a chance that Baker had gotten this all wrong and maybe Chester was actually the target. Besides that, the crime techs had not found much physical evidence at the scene. There were no fingerprints, and since it had been raining, they hadn't been able to collect any footprints or car tracks from outside. So now, Baker reached up and knocked on the front door of the Zametti's house, hoping that Mike Sr. would be able to point them in the right direction. A minute later, Baker and Cass sat in the living room with Mike Sr. and Pat, Mike's mom. Both of Mike's parents seemed incredibly emotional. Michael Sr. was visibly shaking, while Pat just cried. And seeing how upset they were now made Baker realize that Cass had made the right call in sending Michael Sr. home yesterday. Even 24 hours later, it was still going to be very hard to get any sort of real answer out of them because of how upset they were. So Baker decided he would just have to keep it really brief. The first thing he did is he asked Mike Sr. to just go over the actual discovery of the bodies. Tell me what happened. And what he said lined up with everything that Baker had heard from Cass and from dispatch. And so after Mike Sr. went over that, Baker moved on to the real reason he was there. He asked if there was anybody in Mike Jr.'s life who might have wanted to hurt him. Mike Sr. took a few shaky breaths as he thought about the question, and then he said that, there were a few people in the industry that he and his son did not necessarily get along with, but mostly they tried to have good relationships with everyone. Getting in fights was just bad business. But as he was saying this, Mike Sr. suddenly sat up straighter, like he just thought of something. And he said, actually, there was a former coworker who did definitely have a grudge against them. His nephew, Hank Jennings. Hank got mad at them a few years ago about unpaid overtime wages and actually filed a lawsuit against them. Now, they'd eventually paid Hank a settlement, but they still all hated each other. Mike Sr. looked over at his wife, Pat, and she just nodded and said the whole thing had been really high stress and very volatile. Baker took down Hank's information and talked with Mike's parents for just a few more minutes, and then he nodded to Cass, and they stood to leave. Baker knew he still needed to speak more to the Zamettis, but for now, he was going to give them a break, and instead, he and Cass would look into Hank. 2 days later, Baker sat in Cass's office at the Wakefield Police Department, poring over crime scene photos and witness statements. He was starting to get antsy. After meeting with Mike's parents, he'd been excited to speak with Hank Jennings, the disgruntled former employee who also happened to be Mike's cousin. But even though Baker and Cass had sent officers out to track Hank down for an interview, they hadn't been able to get a hold of him yet. However, they had gotten in touch with Mike's wife, Michelle, and had questioned her at her house in Wakefield, but she hadn't given them much. She said that she was at home with her kids at the time of her husband's death, and that she really didn't know of anybody who would want to hurt Mike Jr. Also, Baker and Cass had looked into Allstate Concrete's financial statements, and they had found nothing that suggested there was anything shady or mafia-related happening with the company. Still, Baker knew they were better off than they had been a few days ago, primarily because they had had a chance to review a bunch of the surveillance footage from the businesses around Allstate, and one of those security cameras had been aimed at the street right outside Allstate. Now, this angle didn't show the Allstate parking lot itself, but it did show everyone who entered and exited that parking lot from the street. So this particular camera had picked up Mike Jr.'s truck arriving at work at 7:39 a.m., and then at 7:44 a.m., so 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup truck pulled in as well. And then a few minutes after that, Chester Roberts was seen arriving at Allstate on foot. And then at 7:50, the green truck was seen again, leaving the parking lot, 12 minutes before Michael Sr.'s red truck arrived at 8:02. So, whoever the killer was, it looked like they had driven that green truck and had killed Mike and Chester between 7:44 a.m. and 7:50 a.m. The video wasn't clear enough to show the driver of this mysterious green truck or even see its plates, and it didn't actually show the driver of this vehicle, the killer, getting out of the vehicle and entering the building. But knowing the style and color of very likely the killer's vehicle would definitely help them narrow down potential suspects. Just then, the desk phone rang, and Baker watched as Cass grabbed it and said hello. And then Cass got a confused look on his face before he thanked the caller and said they'd be right over. He hung up and told Baker that was Michelle Zametti, and she'd called to say that she had new information to give them, something that she hadn't mentioned in her first interview, and that it was really important. About 15 minutes later, Baker and Cass sat down across from Michelle in her living room for the second time. And to Baker, Michelle seemed very different from the last time they spoke. 2 days ago, she'd seemed horrified and grief-stricken. But now, she just seemed really nervous. She kept touching her hair and fiddling with a stack of condolence cards on the coffee table. Baker commented that there were a lot of cards, and Michelle just nodded. She said so many people had reached out and sent cards, all their friends and neighbors in Wakefield and in Freedom, New Hampshire, where their second home was. And then Michelle took a breath and just got straight to the reason that she had called them. She said that she had withheld information about one of her neighbors in Freedom. His name was Sean Fitzpatrick, and she'd had an affair with him. Baker cleared his throat in surprise and then asked her to go on. Michelle's eyes filled with tears as she explained how Mike Jr. worked so much and she and the kids spent a lot of time at their lake house, and so that meant they spent a lot of time with Sean. And eventually this friendship between Michelle and Sean had grown into a romance. Baker couldn't believe he was hearing this. A secret love triangle gave both Sean and Michelle plenty of motivation to want Mike dead. But before he could ask any follow-up questions, Michelle said her husband actually knew all about her affair, and that they had been in therapy, and they'd begun to completely turn their marriage around. So finally, a month ago, she'd officially totally broken things off with Sean, and Sean had been really upset about it. Baker shared a look with Cass and could tell they were both thinking the same thing. Obviously, they needed to speak to Sean immediately. But also, Michelle was now back to being a primary suspect too. Maybe she had wanted her husband out of the picture so she could be with Sean, and maybe the only reason she was telling them this was to get ahead of it. However, they would need a lot more evidence before they could prove any of that. So for now, Baker just got Sean's number and address from Michelle and told her they would be in touch. Later that night, Baker and Cass were once again inside of Cass's office, but this time they were there with another officer who was there to give them a crucial update. After speaking with Michelle, Baker had sent a team of officers up to Freedom, New Hampshire to speak with Sean, the neighbor she had been having an affair with. And now, one of those officers was back in Wakefield to tell them what he had learned. And the first thing Baker wanted to know was not about their conversation. It was just, did you see a green truck in Sean's driveway? But the officer shook his head and said Sean did own a truck, but it was bright red. Then he went on to say that when they had spoken to Sean, he had completely denied having an affair with Michelle. Sean had admitted that he had dated a lot of girls, but he'd insisted that he and Michelle were just close family friends. Now, the officers who were there speaking to Sean just stood there and let Sean talk, never telling him that they already knew that Michelle fully admitted to them having an affair, and they knew Sean was lying here. Baker almost laughed when he heard this, because he did not believe Sean at all. And if he was lying like he appeared to be, that made him seem pretty guilty. But before he could say so, the officer added one more thing. He said Sean actually had a solid alibi. He'd been at home on the morning of the murders, and one of his neighbors had actually confirmed it. This particular neighbor took her morning walk every day at 9 a.m., and she'd seen Sean outside his house right around then. Baker sighed. It took around 2 hours to drive between Freedom and Wakefield, so Sean would not have had enough time to kill Mike and Chester by 7:50 a.m. and then get to Freedom by 9. And so suddenly, Sean Fitzpatrick felt like another very promising dead end. On March 18th, so 5 days after the murders of Mike Zimetti and Chester Roberts, Detectives Baker and Cass stood at the back of a church in Wakefield, Massachusetts. They were there for Mike's funeral, and the church was absolutely packed. But the investigators were not just there to pay their respects. They were also there to speak to Hank Jennings, the cousin of Mike who had filed that lawsuit against the concrete company. Since by that point they still had not been able to officially get a hold of Hank, Cass had suggested that they just corner him at Mike's funeral, which he was very likely to attend because, despite his rift with the Zimettis, he was still family. And when the service wrapped up and everybody stood to leave, Baker felt a nudge on his arm. Cass leaned over and whispered that they'd been right, and he pointed out Hank right in the crowd. So, as the attendees started filing out of the church, the investigators pushed their way over to Hank and got in front of him just before he could step outside. Baker immediately noticed that Hank's whole body went tense when they blocked his way, like he wanted to try to make a run for it. So Baker just cut to the chase, and he said, "Hank, will you come with us and speak to us, please?" And Hank's eyes got really wide, and he just said, "No way, not without his lawyer." Then he pushed past the investigators and hurried outside. Baker and Cass didn't follow him. Instead, they just exchanged a look, because they knew now that Hank was obviously their primary suspect. 5 weeks after the funeral, in mid-April of 2006, State Trooper Kevin Baker sat in Detective Cass's office in the Wakefield Police Department. He was wearing gloves, and he was holding a piece of paper that looked like an old-fashioned ransom note. It was covered in letters that had been clearly cut out of a newspaper, and it spelled out a very alarming message. "Close business now, or more family will die." This message had been brought to them by Mike Jr.'s mother, Pat, who said they had received it in the mail that morning. For the Zimettis, for so many reasons, this letter was terrifying. It was not just a reminder of their son's murder, but also a promise that there would be more violence. But for Baker, the note was a lead, which they really needed, because it had been over a month since Michael and Chester were killed, and at this point, the two investigators had managed to rule out basically every one of their suspects, and that included Hank Jennings. They'd learned that Hank's clear reluctance to meet with them was not because of guilt. It was because he had signed a non-disclosure agreement during the settlement with the Zimettis and didn't want to break it. And when they did finally speak to him, he clearly had an alibi. He was at work when Mike and Chester were killed, and Baker and Cass had confirmed it with his employer. And while Hank did own some shotguns, none of them were 16 gauge. So Hank joined the pile of other discarded suspects, like Michelle, who could have had the motive to kill Mike Jr. since she was wrapped up in an affair with their neighbor, but she'd been incredibly cooperative, and they hadn't been able to find any evidence that she might have been involved, like maybe if she had hired someone or something. And her ex-lover, Sean, was also very suspicious and had a strong motive to kill Mike, but his alibi had cleared him. There was no way Sean could have been in Wakefield during the murders because his neighbor saw him about an hour later at his home, which was over 100 miles away. And so now this warning note that looked like a ransom note seemed to point back towards the theory that Baker and Cass had ruled out at the very beginning, that the murders were business-related and the mafia was involved. Cass was a local, and he'd told Baker that there had been a lot of rumors swirling around about the murders in the community. Because of the Zimetti's role in the Big Dig, the general consensus around Wakefield was that the mob theory made the most sense. But Baker really wasn't so sure. I mean, they'd looked into the Zimetti's books and records repeatedly, and they hadn't seen anything to suggest any shady deals or potential mob interaction. Also, Baker didn't think this ransom-style note made from newspaper clippings was the mob style. It just felt kind of silly and performative. Like maybe somebody was trying to make it seem like the mob to lead the investigation in the wrong direction. But even if that was the case, this note was still huge, because maybe whoever had sent it had left their fingerprints or DNA on it. So Baker bagged up the note, and Cass carried it off to send to the crime lab. Baker knew the results from the lab would not be immediate, so while they waited, he wanted to re-interview all their suspects and all their witnesses in case they'd overlooked anything. A few days later, Baker sat alone at Cass's desk reading another witness statement. He'd been revitalized by all the new evidence they'd gathered and was feeling really optimistic about their ability to solve this thing. Aside from conducting new interviews, they had gotten some forensics from that ransom letter. The lab had found both DNA and a palm print on it. Now, they just needed a suspect to compare it to. And just then, the office door flung open and a very excited Cass barged in. An hour later, Baker and Cass walked up the front steps at Michelle Samity's house, and they knocked on her front door. When she answered, they asked her for permission to come inside and take a certain small object from her house. And after Michelle, who was sort of confused by what they were asking for, said, "Okay, come on in," they went right past her, went straight to this object, they bagged it, went right back outside, and sent it off to the crime lab. And as soon as the lab test results came back, Baker and Cass knew they had solved the case. Based on DNA, other forensic evidence, and witness statements, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Michael Samity Jr. and Chester Roberts on the morning of March 13th, 2006. At 7:45 a.m., the killer crept up the stairs that led to Mike's office. They had a shotgun with them, and their heart was racing. They were very nervous about what they were about to do. But Mike Jr., he had to go, and that was all there was to it. So when the killer reached the office door, they barely hesitated before pushing it open and raising their shotgun. Mike was sitting in a chair at his desk, and when the door opened, he turned towards the killer. And when Mike Jr. saw them standing there with a gun pointed at them, his eyes got wide, but the killer fired 2 blasts before Mike could even move, hitting Mike in the face and in the chest. Mike immediately slumped over in his seat and stopped moving, and the killer ran back down the stairs to the garage. But before they could leave, they froze, because they could hear footsteps approaching the building's side door from outside. And so the killer instinctively just hid, not really sure what they were going to do, waiting for this person to either come inside or leave. And then once this person did come inside, it was a man, it was Chester, the killer leapt out and shot him right in the back, and he dropped to the ground, dead. And after killing Chester, the killer felt shocked. I mean, they hadn't planned on killing a second person today. Mike was the target. But they also knew they couldn't just wait around for more people to arrive. So the killer at this point left the building and jumped into the truck they had stolen from one of their neighbors. Then they peeled out of the parking lot less than just 10 minutes after they'd arrived. As they drove, they gripped the wheel tightly, and they knew they should feel guilty about what they had just done. But instead, all they felt was relief, because now they could finally be with the love of their life. It would turn out Michael Samity Jr. and Chester Roberts were not murdered by Mike's wife Michelle, or Mike Jr.'s cousin Hank, or the mob. They were killed by Mike Jr.'s lakeside neighbor and his wife's lover, Sean Fitzpatrick. When Michelle tried to break things off with Sean, she said the only reason she would ever leave Mike was if Mike ended things, or if something happened to him. Now, Michelle meant that as an excuse, but Sean took it as a suggestion. So then he murdered Mike Jr. to steal his wife. Sean took that green pickup truck from a neighbor who was out of town, and then drove it to Wakefield, committed the murders, and then came back. That neighbor who said they saw Sean at his house in Freedom at around 9 a.m., that basically made it impossible for Sean, based on timing, to have gone, committed the murders, and came back. Well, that neighbor called to amend their statement, saying that actually they had seen Sean later in the day. And that change created enough time, enough of a window on the day of the murders, that it was absolutely possible that Sean could have driven, done the murders, and come back. And so once Sean's alibi fell apart, investigators remembered that stack of condolence cards at Michelle's house. So they went over to see if maybe Sean had sent one. And he had. And when they tested the envelope flap, which he had licked to seal it, they got his DNA. Then they matched it to the very threatening letter that sort of looked like a ransom letter that had been given to the Samities, which Sean had put together and sent to them in order to throw police off his trail and make them think that, yeah, the mob was involved here. In June of 2006, Sean Fitzpatrick was arrested and eventually received 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders of Michael Samity Jr. and Chester Roberts. Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never before heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're at the Like Button's house and need to use their bathroom, don't use their toilet paper. Instead, use dozens and dozens of quadruple ply paper towels. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Around 7:20 p.m. on the evening of December 11th, 2002, a police department in a rural English county called Surrey started receiving all these frantic emergency calls. Now, all of these calls were coming from drivers on a heavily trafficked highway called the A3, and they all were saying the same things. They had seen this totally reckless driver with super bright headlights that was weaving in and out of traffic and going at high speeds and nearly crashing into people. And then a couple of the callers said they actually saw this car go down the embankment off the side of the highway, and so it looked like they might have crashed. And so, of course, this police department, after getting all these calls, decided to send out a couple of officers to see what was going on. When the 2 officers got out to the A3 and began patrolling the area on the A3 where all these calls were saying they had seen this reckless driver, they didn't see the driver. They didn't see a wreck on the side of the road. They didn't see any signs of an accident. I mean, there was nothing there. Now, had only one person called in about this wild, reckless driver, at this point, the officers would have chalked this up to a mistake or even a prank. But so many people called in about this one particular reckless driver on the A3 that these 2 officers decided to just keep on looking and really see if they can figure out where this driver went. And so to this point, the 2 police officers had been just driving on the A3 to try to find this driver. And so they decided they would park their vehicle, get out, and walk on foot on the edge of the highway because there were these huge forests that lined either side of the A3. In fact, Surrey, the county in England where this was one of the most heavily forested areas in all of England. And so these forests on either side of the A3 were very dense. You could not see very far into them. And so these officers were thinking that it might be possible that this driver, if they were driving as recklessly as all the callers made it seem like, they could have veered off the highway, gone down the embankment, and then because they were going at such a high speed, they could have crashed their way into one of these forests and basically disappeared from view from the road. That in order to see this crash in the forest, you'd have to be basically in the forest. And so these 2 officers, they pulled over, they got out, and they began walking along the edge of the highway, staring into the forest, looking for a sign of a car wreck. And sure enough, after walking for a while, one of the officers spotted something deep in the woods that looked almost metallic or plastic. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be in the forest. And so the officers made their way into the tree line and began walking through all the trees. And as they got closer, they realized very clearly there was a car. There was a wreck in the forest. And so the 2 officers, they begin running towards the wreck. They're calling for backup on the radio. They get to this wreck in the middle of the forest, and they're on the driver's side, and they look inside the car, and there's no driver in the driver's seat, but they looked through the car to the passenger side, and they saw the front passenger door was wide open, and on the ground on the other side of the car was very clearly a body. And so the 2 police officers rushed around the car to get a better look at the body. And when they did, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It didn't make any sense. Like, what was this? Now, to understand why these police officers were so caught off guard by what they were seeing, we need to go back 5 months to July 16th, 2002. On that night, a 21-year-old man named Christopher Brian Chandler finished up his beer at a pub in West London. And for reference, where this pub was located was about 1 hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey where the car was found in the woods. This night, Christopher had gone to this pub with a close friend of his. This was meant to be a fun night out. But, as Chris is finishing up this beer, he began to feel really antsy because it turned out Christopher was actually wanted by police in London for robbery, and so he hated staying in one place for too long. And so the only people who even knew where Christopher was the friend he was with at the bar, and then also Christopher's brother. He knew he was at this particular pub. And so finally, Christopher got so anxious about being in this pub for too long that he told the friend he was with that he just wanted to leave, and so he said goodnight to his friend. The friend stayed at the pub, and Christopher left, got in his car, and began driving south. But Christopher never arrived at the place he was trying to go. He just sort of disappeared, and nobody heard from him again. Christopher's brother eventually would report Christopher missing, but remember, the brother knows Christopher is wanted for robbery, and so Christopher suddenly going on the lam and just disappearing for a while was kind of par for the course, and so the brother really didn't think this was a big deal. And also, the police felt the same way because they know Christopher is trying to elude them, and so it makes sense he would be missing. And so as a result, nobody really followed up on Christopher's missing person report. Everybody just kind of moved on. That is, until 5 months later, when all those drivers began calling into the police in Surrey about seeing this totally reckless driver careening down the A3, who eventually crashed into a ditch. And then those two officers, they went out to that stretch of A3, and sure enough, it was Christopher's car, and the body on the ground was Christopher. However, there was a problem. When the two police officers walked up on Christopher's car and saw it for the first time, they were struck by how old it looked. But it didn't really register with them why that would matter. It just stood out to them that this is a really, really old and rusted up car. But when they went around to look at the body on the ground, Christopher's body, they saw that his body was actually mostly a skeleton, which meant Christopher did not crash and die on this night, December 11th, 2002. Very likely, he crashed and died 5 months earlier, right around the time he disappeared. Now, the Surrey police, they say that this was all just one big coincidence, that the reckless driver that all these drivers were reporting that night on the A3 must have not crashed and actually just kind of got away, and then just by coincidence, when the police were searching that area of the A3 for the reckless driver, they happened upon Chris and his car. But remember, several of the drivers who called in that night about seeing this reckless driver on the A3, they specifically said they saw the car veer off the embankment and crash down below near the tree line. Like, this is a serious crash. Someone needs to get out here with an ambulance because probably someone's hurt. And then when the police got out and searched the exact area where this crash supposedly happened, they find Chris's car that had all the hallmarks of a car that was driving recklessly on the A3 that veered off and crashed into the woods. I mean, they found Chris and his car because of these calls, but it could not have been Chris. But what other car could it have been? As of today, we do not have a good explanation for how this happened, and so it's been dubbed the A3 ghost crash. Well, we finally did it. I don't know if it was all the acid we poured into their contact lens solution, or if it was all the wild predators we released in their house, but somehow, some way, we killed the like button. And I know this because the ghost of the like button paid me a visit last night. And after slapping me right in the anti-tragus and then pouring fox urine in my eyes, the ghost of the like button said, "Listen here, Mr. Ballin, if you want to bring me back to life and keep up with your antics, you need to bring me one piece of brand new Mr. Ballin merchandise." And I said, "Are you kidding me? Of course! We just launched a brand new merch line called Ballin Basics on shopmrballin.com right in time for the holidays. Ballin Basics has all your Mr. Ballin essentials like a sick hoodie, a great crew neck, heck, there's even a special collector's item, the old Sigalang pin, and they're all numbered. There's only 500 of them, so get them while supplies last. So again, go to shopmrballin.com. Ballin Basics is live right now, so get your new merch, get your collector's item pin, old Sika-yang! Meanwhile, I'll work on resurrecting the like button so we can continue to find fulfillment in our lives by slipping some mayonnaise in the like button's peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Happy holidays, everybody! Go to shopmrballin.com. Mr. Ballin, ooh. It's not even funny. On the morning of August 2nd, 2017, two men sat together laughing inside of a bar in a tiny village in northern France. The men were named Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin, and even though there was a massive age difference between them, Lucien was 69 years old and Olivier was 38 years old, the two were totally inseparable, to the point where the people in the village referred to them as father and son. Lucien had spent his whole life working in manufacturing in a nearby city, but just 4 years earlier, he had finally retired and he had moved into a small home inside of this northern French village. But when he had first moved into this new home, he had been very lonely and sad. Lucien was divorced, he struggled with alcohol, and he had had a really tough life, and he just wasn't doing well. But when he met Olivier, his whole life turned around. When the two met, Olivier also was kind of like a down on his luck guy. He was struggling with some health issues that made it hard to work, and so for years he had been bouncing between the nearby city and this village in northern France looking for work somewhat unsuccessfully. And so when these two happened to connect, it's like they bonded over having kind of difficult lives. And for Lucien, what really mattered to him was Olivier, despite being so much younger than him, did not treat Lucien like he was this dried up, worthless old man. He treated Lucien like a peer. And so together, these two very unlikely best friends began kind of orchestrating their lives around the other. And before long, it was like their lives had all this new structure and routine and meaning to them, because again, the two men got to be together basically all day long. So, on this particular morning, as Olivier and Lucien were together at this bar, they began talking about what they wanted to do that night. And they settled on having a barbecue at Lucien's house. Lucien would cook up some beef and they would sit out on his back garden patio and just spend the night together. It sounded like a wonderful plan. And in fact, the bartender would say that when Olivier and Lucien finally left the bar that day, that he recalled overhearing them being so excited about this particular barbecue. And so that evening, Olivier and Lucien arrived at Lucien's house and they went out to the back patio where Lucien had already draped a nice tablecloth over this small round table. It was a red and white checkered patterned tablecloth, and on this table was an open bottle of wine and some cheese and a baguette. And so Olivier, he sat down and began enjoying some wine and bread, and Lucien walked over to the grill and began cooking up the beef. Lucien had a neighbor. We're going to call her Marie because we don't actually know her real name. And Marie's second floor window overlooked Lucien's garden patio where the two men were having this cookout. And so that night, Marie did glance out and saw the two men kind of listening to music and goofing around. And she was used to them spending lots of time together. And she was also used to them staying up late at night. And so she figured, tonight's going to be another one of those nights where these guys are up late, having wine, celebrating, whatever. She was just going to shut the window and try to ignore the noise coming in and just let them do their thing. And so eventually Marie would do that. She would go to bed to the sound of music coming from next door and the sound of men talking. And then the next morning, when Marie got up around 6 a.m., she looked out that window again and frankly was not that shocked at what she saw. Lucien was still just sitting at the table, looking like he could be eating some bread or still drinking wine, and Olivier had clearly passed out on the ground. Now, Marie didn't judge. She knew these two liked to stay up late and drink and do stuff like this, and so she thought, you know what? None of my business. Then at 9 a.m., so 3 hours after Marie had first woken up, she left her house to go to another neighbor's house to feed their chickens while they were away for the day. As she passed by Lucien's house, she glanced into his back garden patio, and she saw Lucien was still just sitting at the table, and Olivier was still passed out on the ground. It was like they hadn't moved for 3 hours. But again, Marie's thinking, none of my business. And so she just kept on going, went to her neighbor's house and fed the chickens. But when Marie came back to her house 3 hours later around noon, she looked again into Lucien's backyard and she saw the two men still had not moved. Lucien is sitting at the table and Olivier is laying on the ground. And suddenly Marie's thinking, wait a minute, the sun is high in the sky right now. These guys aren't moving. They're going to get heat stroke. We got to do something about this. And so she yelled out to Olivier and Lucien, but she got no response. And so Marie just walked into Lucien's backyard. And as she got closer and closer to the two men, she realized that they were not moving at all. Like they were not breathing. Something was horribly wrong here. And so Marie, she just turned and ran to another neighbor's house. She told them what was going on. And they got these big pots of water and they ran back and doused Olivier and Lucien with water, trying to get them to snap out of their drunken stupor. But the two men did not move at all when the water hit them. Clearly, they were dead. The next day, the local prosecutor announced there was going to be an investigation into the two men's deaths, which were being classified as criminal acts. And the prosecutor also said that it seemed like Lucien and Olivier died at the same time, and so most likely this was either a double homicide or a murder-suicide, and the primary theory as to what killed the two men was poison put in their food. And so police sent off the canned beans the two men were eating to this institution in Paris to test it for something called botulism, which is a deadly toxin that will grow inside of canned foods, but it came back negative. And then also police sent off the rest of the food the two men were eating to various other laboratories to be tested for poisons. And again, all of it came back negative. There was nothing that the police could detect in any of the food they ate. And so police were kind of confused for a minute, but then the autopsies came back for Olivier and Lucien, and everything changed. Lucien and Olivier were not murdered. This was not a murder-suicide. They didn't die from botulism or from some poison in their food. They died because of a set of very particular circumstances. Both Lucien and Olivier suffered from non-fatal minor medical issues. Lucien had bad dental health and so was missing a couple of teeth, and Olivier was suffering from a heart condition called cardiomegaly, which means his heart was slightly enlarged and somewhat fragile. However, his condition was totally being monitored by doctors and was under control. But just for a second, on the night of August 2nd, 2017, when Lucien and Olivier were having that cookout in Lucien's backyard, their non-fatal minor medical issues suddenly became a really, really big deal. Lucien cooked up a big plate of beef rib. Now, beef rib can be difficult to chew even when you have all your teeth and take your time, but Lucien was missing teeth and he loved this beef rib so much he was wolfing it down really quickly, and so he wasn't chewing it enough, and at some point he swallowed a particularly big unchewed bite and he began to choke. And when that happened, his best buddy, Olivier, sitting across from him, he stood up to try to help his friend who's basically dying right in front of him. And the stress of this moment caused his heart to seize up, his heart which is already enlarged and fragile, and he had a heart attack and died. And then Lucien, who now has no one to help him, continued to sit at the table trying to get this beef out of his throat, but he couldn't, and he eventually asphyxiated and died as well, hunched over at the table. A little after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 2007, three men launched a 35-foot white catamaran called the Caz 2 from a marina in northeastern Australia, kicking off what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. The captain of the Caz 2 was 56-year-old Des Batten, and for months he'd been training for this trip. And the two friends that Des was bringing with him on this trip were Jim Tunstead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's brother, Peter Tunstead, who was 69 years old. All three of the men had spent a lot of time plotting their actual course they'd be going on, which was from this marina on the northeastern side of Australia, up and around the north side, and then down the western coast to Perth, which was their final destination and where all three men lived. In total, this trip was supposed to take 8 weeks, and all three men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending an entire 2 months basically just drinking beers and fishing. Now, Des, Jim, and Peter were not the types to blow off responsibility to go party. I mean, they were devoted family men. All of them had been married for 30 plus years. Des had 2 kids, Jim had 4 kids, and Peter had 5 kids. But they were all either retired or nearing retirement, and this trip was going to be kind of a way to celebrate the end of an era. And while all three of them had gone on other big sailing trips, this one easily was the biggest one in terms of the distance they were covering and how much prep went into it and how expensive it was. I mean, this was like 10x the scope and scale of any other sailing trip they had done. And so, on April 15th, 2007, shortly after the three men had launched their boat and kicked off this big trip, Peter's wife would call him just to see how it was going. And she would say, Peter was in great spirits, and she could hear the other two men laughing in the background, and it sounded like they were about to start fishing and maybe have a couple of beers. And so it seemed very much to Peter's wife like this trip was going as well as it could be so far. And so eventually, Peter told his wife that he had to go, he told her he loved her, and then they hung up. Now, Des, who was the captain of the Kaz 2, was adamant about safety being the top concern for this trip. Even though all three men were relatively healthy and had a lot of sailing experience, and even though Des was a member of a volunteer marine rescue group and so literally could be called on to go perform rescues at sea, despite all this experience and know-how, before they kicked off this trip, Des made Jim and Peter go through all these man overboard drills on the Kaz 2 to make sure they knew how to do it if for some reason, an emergency arose out at sea. And so the men got really comfortable using all the life-saving equipment and going over all the procedures. And then also when they charted their course, Des stressed that at no point should they be sailing into open water. They needed to stay close to shore the whole time just because it was safer. And so when Jim began filming a video around 10 a.m. on the day they set sail for this trip, you can clearly see the shore in the background of this video, so they're following the course they had planned. But a couple of hours after Jim had shot that video on the day they left, a woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know Des, Jim, or Peter and had never seen the Kaz 2 before, she was fishing in an area called Champagne Bay when she looked out into the water and she saw the Kaz 2, a white 35-foot catamaran, sailing east to west across the horizon. And then at some point, as Isabel was watching this boat, which really meant nothing to her, she just happened to be watching it, she saw it make a quick 90-degree turn and began sailing out towards the open ocean away from the coastline. Now, remember, Isabel knows nothing of this boat or its occupants, and so has no idea that Des, Peter, and Jim had been so clear about at no point will we sail into the open ocean. It's too dangerous. Stay close to shore. She didn't know that. And so she just saw a ship turning and sailing out to the open water, and she thought, okay, whatever. So she didn't go and report what she saw. It was only later on when details emerged about what happened on the Kaz 2 that she would later come forward and say, hey, I saw that boat and this is what they did. The next day, April 16th, two more people would spot the Kaz 2. These were two men who also did not know Des, Peter, Jim. They didn't know Kaz 2. They didn't know Isabel. In fact, these two men didn't know each other. But independently, on this day, they looked out near Champagne Bay and they saw the Kaz 2 sailing east to west in the exact same spot that Isabel had seen it the day before. Now, remember, the Kaz 2 was traveling from that marina on the northeast side of Australia all the way around to Perth. It was a point A to point B trip. There was no reason the Kaz 2 would ever double back and be in the same place 24 hours later, but here we were 24 hours later, and two more people are seeing the Kaz 2 in the same place that Isabel had seen it, and so that made no sense. But again, these two men who saw the Kaz 2, they just saw it and thought nothing of it because they don't know anything about this boat. It wasn't until later that they eventually came forward with what they saw. Then, one more day after that, on April 17th, there were these fishermen that were out in their boats a little farther north of Champagne Bay, where Isabel and the two other men had seen the Kaz 2 on consecutive days. And these fishermen, they spotted the Kaz 2. And again, these fishermen do not know the Kaz 2. They don't know its occupants. They're just seeing this ship. Except this time, the fishermen, when they saw the Kaz 2, they thought something was wrong because they saw the Kaz 2 from a distance navigating its way fairly close to shore in an area that these fishermen knew was full of coral reefs. It's a very dangerous area to be piloting any ship. In addition, the sail of the Kaz 2 was totally ripped to shreds. And so the fishermen, they're looking at the ship, wondering what they're doing, But the pilot of the ship looked so in control as he's navigating his way through the coral reefs that the fishermen thought, okay, he knows what he's doing, so, leave him alone. But again, later on, they would report what they saw. It wasn't until the next day, April 18th, so 3 days after Des, Peter, and Jim had set sail, that anybody realized there was an issue with the crew of the Kaz 2. Because on April 18th, a Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying over the Great Barrier Reef, and they looked down and they saw the Kaz 2 with its badly damaged sails, piloting all around this very dangerous part of the water to be piloting. And so the crew on board the helicopter attempted to radio down to the Kaz 2 to see if they were okay, but no one from the Kaz 2 called back to the helicopter. And so as they're waiting for a response from the Kaz 2, the helicopter crew is watching the pilot of the Kaz 2 clearly, navigating the boat in between coral reefs. And it seemed like, despite the damage to the sails, he knew what he was doing. And so to the crew on the helicopter, this didn't really look like an emergency, but it seemed like something worth flagging. And so they called the Marine police and said, hey, we have this ship here that's not responding. We think they're okay, but you might want to come take a look. And so the Marine police, they would come out to the area where the helicopter had said they had seen the Kaz 2, and when they got there, the Kaz 2 was gone. At this point, the Marine police got some information about the boat, Kaz 2, and discovered who owned the boat and who was on this trip, so Des, Peter, and Jim, and the police would get in touch with all of their families, and they would all tell police that besides Peter's wife, who talked to Peter on that morning they left, no one had heard from any of the men. They had gone totally silent since that first day. And so when police heard this, they knew this had to be some kind of emergency, and so a search was launched to find the Kaz 2. And 48 hours later, a rescue helicopter that was part of the search was about 80 or so miles off the northeastern coast of Australia when they looked down and they spotted the Kaz 2. And it still had all torn up sails, and it was kind of spinning listlessly in the water, and from the helicopter, they couldn't see anybody on board the ship. It was totally vacant on the deck. Now, at this point, authorities really have no idea what's going on with this boat or its occupants. It was possible that maybe they had been hijacked, and so Des, Peter, and Jim could be held hostage down below, along with the people that took them hostage. Or maybe the boat just got stolen, and Des, Peter, and Jim are not on this boat, and that it's just the criminals on board, and again, they're down below, hidden from view. So authorities, they don't know, but they decided to take a risk and just send somebody down to get on that boat and just see what was going on. So a rescue officer on board the rescue helicopter named Corey Benson was lowered by a rope where he was dropped into the water, and then Corey swam by himself over to the Kaz 2 and he climbed up the side of the boat and he stepped onto the deck, and right away he noticed it was kind of like eerily quiet on board the boat. There was nobody he could see, and there was no sign of any disturbance, minus the sails of the ship being all tattered. And for a second, Corey thought about maybe calling out for Des, Peter, and Jim to see if they were down below and could come up and solve this mystery. But then he also worried that if he called out, there could be some bad people on board this boat, and he didn't want to draw their attention. And so Corey was quiet and just began walking towards the front of the boat. And as he did, he began to notice signs that people must have recently been on board this boat doing normal things. Like, for example, there was a fishing rod that was cast out into the water that was anchored to a post on the side of the boat that looked like it had just been operated minutes ago. There was a blue mug of coffee that was just sitting on a table that looked like maybe someone had been drinking from it recently. There was a neatly folded t-shirt on another chair with a set of glasses on them. I mean, there was just all these kind of tells that this was a boat that was being used recently. And when Corey actually got to the front of the boat where the captain would stand, he saw the engine was actually still on. It was idling. And so Corey turned it off. Now, at this point, Corey knew his next step was going down the stairs and opening up the door that led into the cabin down below to see if Des, Peter, and Jim were down there. But he also knew when he went down there, despite there being backup up in the helicopter and more people making their way out here, Corey would be all alone if there were criminals or bad people down there. But this was his job. And so after taking a deep breath, he turned and walked down the few steps, and he got to the door that led to the cabin. He grabbed the handle and he opened it up. And the room he was walking into was kind of like a half living room, half kitchen area. And he saw there was this table, and on it was a newspaper that was dated April 15th. so the day the Caz set sail. And then on the wall behind the newspaper was a calendar where days had been marked off all the way through April 14th. April 15th was not marked off. But also nearby on a table was a computer that was still plugged in and on and looked very much like someone had just been using it. And also there were plates of food that were out that didn't look that old that also seemed like people must have just been eating from them. And then also Corey could see past this common area into the bedroom, and very obviously the bunks inside of there had been slept in. And so basically everything seemed like it was where it should be. There was just one problem. Des, Peter, and Jim were not on this ship. There was no sign of where they were. They were just gone. And there was nobody else on board the ship. It was just completely abandoned with no sign of what happened. Des, Jim, and Peter were never found. And so we have no idea what actually happened to them. Nor do we have any idea why they were seen by Isabel and the two men and the fishermen doing all these weird things, like randomly piloting out towards open water, which totally went against their plan, which was stay close to shore, be safe. Or, why on that second day they were seen in the same spot near Champagne Bay, indicating they had doubled back after going towards open water. That went against their plan, which was point A to point B. Why are they doubling back around? And so unfortunately, this whole thing is just one big mystery that has yet to be solved. Since you made it to the end of this video, I think it's safe to assume that you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. And so if that's true, this is your reminder that we actually have a brand new weekly show, a podcast, that's free and available on every platform right now. It's called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, and it's definitely a strange, dark, and mysterious show like you've come to expect. But obviously the focus of the show is medical mysteries. From bizarre, unheard of diseases to miraculous recoveries to strange medical mishaps and unexplained deaths, and all of them have big plot twists at the end. The first 8 episodes of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries are out right now on every platform, and this Tuesday coming up, another 8 episodes are going to be released on Amazon Music. Or if you listen on other podcast platforms like Apple or Spotify or whatever, you will continue to get one new episode of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries every Tuesday. And if all this was not enough to convince you to at least go check out MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, then hopefully this sneak peek of episode number 9, called Sleep Addict, releasing this Tuesday, will push you over the edge. After you listen to the sneak peek, be sure to go follow and turn on all notifications for MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Here is the sneak peek of episode number 9, Sleep Addict. On the morning of July 30th, 1976, a young doctor examined an elderly veteran at Bloomsburg Hospital in Pennsylvania, desperately looking for a way to keep this man alive. His lungs were filling up with fluid, but no matter how many times the doctor drained them, the fluid just kept coming back. The man suddenly began to spasm in his bed, coughing up a bloody pink froth. Dr. Ernest Campbell tried to stay calm, but he knew he was running out of options. He'd seen people die from respiratory failure before, but this had progressed faster and more suddenly than anything he'd ever experienced. And this patient was only one of several in the hospital with the same disturbing symptoms. In fact, Dr. Campbell had heard about similar cases appearing across the entire state, and so he was terrified that this was the onset of a deadly epidemic. And if it was, there might be no way to stop it. Thank you for listening. Now go check out MrBallen's Medical Mysteries wherever you get your podcasts. It's free, new episodes every week. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's stories, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, which has hundreds more stories just like these, but many of them are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. Today, I'm going to share 3 stories about people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a nice high-end teeth whitening kit, but don't tell them you've secretly replaced the whitener with red hair dye.
Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 8:40 a.m. on July 7, 1967, a 17-year-old girl named Nancy McEwen was driving along a highway in Brooklyn, New York. She was on her way to her job as a secretary at her dad's office in Brooklyn, and she was coming from her home in Long Island, New York. Now, the commute to her office took about an hour, but Nancy didn't mind because her dad had just got her this beautiful, brand new yellow Camaro, and she loved driving it. And the highway she was on had this amazing view of the beach and ocean down below. And so that day, Nancy rolled down her window so she could feel the ocean breeze as she drove, and then she took in a deep breath and she smiled. At the same time Nancy was doing this, a police lieutenant was driving in his car a couple cars back from Nancy, and as he was just driving along, he suddenly sees this yellow Camaro that to this point had been driving completely normally, suddenly veer off the road, miraculously missed the oncoming cars, and then smashed into a tree on the side of the road. And so the police lieutenant instinctively jammed on his brakes and veered over to the shoulder and stopped behind the Camaro. And as the lieutenant got out of the car, he was thinking clearly the driver must have just had some kind of medical emergency because he didn't see any obstacles in the road. And, the Camaro had been driving completely normally to that point. So what would cause them to veer and crash into the road at such a high speed other than a medical emergency? And so the lieutenant jumps out of the car, runs over to the driver's side window, and he looks inside and he sees this teenage girl, this blonde teenage girl, and she's slumped over the wheel. And she's not looking up at him. She's not making any sound. She's just sitting there. And so he opens up the door and he asks her, are you okay? And she didn't say anything, but she did moan. And so she was breathing, she was alive, and there weren't any obvious physical injuries. Clearly she's just crashed into this tree at high speed, so she's definitely shaken up. But there weren't any obvious grievous injuries that have occurred here, at least none that he could see. And so he asked her again, hey, are you okay? What's going on here? And she just continued to moan. And so again, considering he's looking at her and she seems, basically okay, all things considered, he thought, maybe she's drunk. That would kind of explain, the sudden veering off the road. And so at this point, the lieutenant radioed for backup and also called for an ambulance. And while he waited, he began searching the car, just basically looking to see if maybe there was some clue in the car as to what happened here. For example, containers of alcohol. And so he's looking around and he doesn't see any empty bottles and he can't smell any alcohol in the car. But still, this whole time, the girl is not responding. She's just moaning and just kind of slumped over there. And then a couple of minutes later, he hears sirens and he looks up and a bunch of first responders came over. They pulled the girl out of the car, got her in the ambulance, and off to the hospital she went. Once Nancy got to the hospital, medical staff was able to determine that she was not drunk. But she did clearly appear to be having some kind of medical emergency. But they didn't know what it was. And again, there was no visible injuries on her. She just basically looked really shaken up and was non-responsive. And quickly, after Nancy was at the hospital, her condition only got worse, to the point where doctors were giving her shots of adrenaline to try to keep her alive. But it didn't work. And at 11:30 a.m., roughly 2.5 hours after Nancy crashed into the tree, she died. And it was only then, after Nancy was dead, that the medical staff made a discovery, something they had totally missed when Nancy had first came in. And that was, on the back of her head, hidden amongst her hair, was a small circular hole. It was a bullet wound, and for some reason, it didn't bleed at all. Clearly, Nancy did not just randomly veer off the road and smash into a tree. No, she had been shot. About 30 minutes after this discovery was made, a detective named Albert Seidman was standing next to Nancy's crashed car on the side of the highway. Seidman had a reputation as being this totally no-nonsense detective who effectively would stop at nothing to try to solve a case. By this point, he'd already spoken to Nancy's parents, who obviously were devastated and very confused by their daughter's death. They said that, Nancy never got in trouble and certainly didn't have any enemies, and so it made no sense that somebody had just shot her as she was driving. And Detective Seidman had to agree. This was not an average murder case. But regardless, he knew the best place to start this investigation was Nancy's car. The car was actually in pretty good shape. Despite striking this tree at high speeds, the body of the car basically remained intact. And so Seidman began going inside the car and looking all around it, looking for bullet holes to see where this bullet came in and struck the driver. But he found none. Really, there was nothing in the car that gave any information away about what actually happened here. Also, adding to the mystery here is Seidman knew there had been that police lieutenant who just happened to be driving a few cars back from Nancy when she suddenly veered off the road and crashed. And he would say that he did not hear any gunshots, although admittedly he wasn't really listening for gunshots, but he said everything was normal and then the car just veered and crashed. He couldn't understand it. Detective Seidman had briefly considered that, maybe Nancy had been shot by somebody inside of her car. But because of the presence of that lieutenant who immediately was on the scene and was basically looking at the car from the time it crashed all the way until the ambulance arrived, he said there was nobody else in the car and I did not witness anybody fleeing the scene. The whole situation was very bizarre. But Detective Seidman, thinking logically, thought, okay, well, we know she's been shot. So even though nobody knows how that happened, well, there has to be a shell casing somewhere for the round that struck her. And so for the rest of the day, Seidman and his team canvassed that whole highway all around that area looking for a shell casing, or really any clue that a gun had been fired in the vicinity. But they found nothing. By the end of the day, Detective Seidman was beginning to feel pretty disappointed about how the investigation was going so far. But he thought to himself, okay, well, I know I haven't found anything promising yet. But remember, she was shot not in some secluded area. She was shot on a major highway in Brooklyn, New York, a city of over 2.5 million people. I mean, someone somewhere must have seen or heard something. And so instead of continuing to look for a shell casing, Seidman abandoned that idea and decided to go find witnesses. Over the next 5 days, Detective Seidman and his team scoured Brooklyn and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, looking for anybody who had any information about this shooting. They also put out a public plea for information and were fielding tips that way. But at the end of those 5 days, despite the huge number of interviews, they really hadn't gotten anywhere. As Seidman began to feel his frustration rising, because once again, it just felt like they were hitting another dead end on this case, he told himself, they must have missed something. They've talked to a ton of people, but maybe they were too quick. Maybe they weren't asking the right questions. And so on July 12th, he gathered up his team and he circled some spots on a map of Brooklyn and said, look guys, we're gonna go back to these key areas that are sort of positioned in the best angles to have maybe heard or seen something with the shooting. And we're gonna ask some more questions and just see if maybe these people have something we didn't catch. In one of those circled areas, the police discovered a gas station that was owned by a guy named Theodore DeLisi, and it was located only 2 blocks away from where Nancy had been shot. And on the morning of July 12th, when the police officers rolled up to this gas station, Theodore was working and he saw the police coming towards him, and right away he knew this had to be about Nancy McEwen. So Theodore had been following this case really closely as it was developing for 2 reasons. One, Nancy had been shot really close to his gas station, so there's that proximity bias. And 2, Theodore was actually friends with Nancy's father and had known Nancy growing up. And so this case really hit close to home. When the police walked inside the gas station, Theodore immediately asked them, "Are you here about Nancy?" And they would say yes. And that's when he would tell them his connection to Nancy and how he was following this case really closely. But despite his proximity to where she had been shot, he said unfortunately he hadn't seen or heard anything. But then Theodore quickly followed that up and said that, well, while he had been at the gas station in the morning for a little bit, he did take off at some point to go fishing out on the water in his boat, which was not too far away. But even from there too, he still said he didn't hear or see anything. But it was kind of noisy out on the water anyways, so, he really wouldn't have heard anything out there anyhow. The police nodded and asked some simple follow-up questions to Theodore about, take us through what happened that morning, what'd you see, were there other fishermen out there, when you were at the gas station, did you see anything unusual, just kind of seeing if there was anything that would jog his memory. And Theodore was answering every question as truthfully as he could, and at some point, he began to think really hard about what he actually saw when he was out on the water fishing. And suddenly, it all clicked. Theodore knew who killed Nancy. It would turn out at 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, the exact moment Nancy was shot, veered off the road and crashed, Theodore was in fact out in his boat fishing. Except at 8:40 a.m., he wasn't actually fishing. Instead, he had a can, and he threw that can into the water. And once he saw the can, he kind of kept staring at it, and then he raised his rifle and he fired a shot at the can. But he missed, and the bullet, by some fluke of physics, ricocheted off the surface of the water, went up into the highway right as Nancy had rolled her window down, struck her in the head, and killed her. Theodore knew he had been shooting his gun out on the water, but what he saw was the bullet hit the water. He didn't think for a second he could have fired up towards the highway. It was when police began asking questions that he thought, oh my goodness, it is possible. A ricochet could have struck her in the head. Theodore was charged with homicide, but ultimately a grand jury chose not to indict him, citing that this truly was an accident. Theodore did not serve any jail time, but he was fined $100 for firing a rifle within city limits. Hey guys! Did you know you can get your strange, dark, and mysterious fix anytime, anywhere with the Mr. Ballin podcast on Amazon Music? Well, you can. There are tons of stories waiting to be binged right now, plus there are exclusive stories on there that have never been shared on this YouTube channel. Amazon Music listeners get to listen to new episodes an entire month before everybody else. You can also listen to my other show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, 2 weeks early and totally ad-free on Amazon Music. If you're already a Prime member, well, you already have access to those 2 shows, plus hundreds of other top podcasts ad-free, all at no extra cost. That's right, your Prime membership includes Amazon Music absolutely free. So if you're ready to dive deeper into strange, dark, and mysterious stories, well, go download the Amazon Music app today and listen to the Mr. Ballin podcast and also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. Now, back to today's stories. On the evening of September 17th, 2021, a 42-year-old preacher named Jason Thornburg was cleaning up his motel room in Euless, Texas, which is a small city between Dallas and Fort Worth. Jason was going to be hosting a small Bible study group in his motel room in a few minutes, and even though really it was not that dirty, he was really taking time to ensure it was as clean and inviting as he could possibly make it. So normally, Jason would host these Bible study groups at his house. But unfortunately, Jason's house burned down just that past summer, and he lost everything. But Jason was so committed to God and spreading the word of God that he still wanted to continue having these Bible study groups, even if it meant, doing it in this kind of crummy motel room. And so Jason walked around the room, picking up laundry and straightening up his bed. And then after kind of arranging chairs in a circle for the various participants he was expecting, he went over to a cabinet, pulled out some Bibles, and right as he was about to start placing these Bibles on each chair, he heard a knock at the door. And Jason was really excited because he knew that had to be someone who was here for this Bible study. And so he walked right over, Bibles in hand, to the door. He opened it up, and standing outside the door was this big guy covered in tattoos, kind of looking down at Jason. And Jason broke into a big smile. He was so happy to see this guy. The man's name was David Luaris. And Jason had previously met him when he was out on the street doing outreach for his church, and he had invited David to, anytime he wanted to come by the motel and be a part of this Bible study group. Now, Jason knew that David was really not the kind of guy who went to church or really showed any real interest in God or, the Bible, but, Jason took all kinds, and he was just hopeful that maybe David would show up someday. And now, here David was. However, David told Jason that the reason he was here was actually not for the Bible study group. He was here because he was in the middle of a crisis and he didn't know where else to turn. He confessed to Jason that he had begun using drugs and gotten mixed up in some criminal activity, and there's some dangerous people out there that he was sort of running with, and now his concern was some of those dangerous people were coming to get him. And so he literally felt like his life was in danger. Now, when Jason heard this, he was surprised. But at the same time, he could tell that David was being very authentic and just needed help. And Jason felt like, his job ultimately was to serve God and all of God's people. And David was one of those people, and he was in need of help. And so if all Jason did was simply provided safe haven for David inside of this motel room, then that was serving God, and it was the right thing to do. And so Jason immediately said, "No problem, David." He handed him a Bible and said, "Come on in." David took the Bible awkwardly and just kind of stood there for a moment, not really sure what to do. But then Jason said, "Hey, relax, just come inside, take a seat." And so David did. He walked in, he sat down with the Bible, and then Jason actually came over and sat down next to him. And the two of them, for about 15 minutes, just made kind of awkward small talk. Jason could tell, David is completely on edge. He was staring at the door, which was now closed, and he just clearly was very anxious and paranoid. And so Jason really wasn't talking about the Bible or God or anything. He was just, trying to calm David down and show him that this was a safe place. And then after about 15 minutes of this, when David had somewhat calmed down, and also by this point, nobody else had showed up for this Bible study group, Jason decided, okay, you know what? Maybe I'll just begin the Bible study with David. It kind of gives us something to do. And so Jason got up, he locked the door, showing David that it's just going to be them, it's safe here. And he told David to go ahead and open his Bible to a certain page. And then the two of them just began reading the Bible together. And for hours, they just sat there reading the Bible, and Jason spoke to David about, teachings of God and how to lead your life in a way to serve other people. And, for the most part, David did completely calm down and seemed to really be embracing this Bible study. But eventually, despite how well this Bible study was going, it did need to come to an end at some point, at least in Jason's mind. And when he began to notice it was getting dark outside, he sort of began wrapping it up, and he shut his Bible and sort of expected that David would take a hint and leave, but David didn't. Instead, when David began to realize that, hey, this is over now and it's time for you to go, David looked at Jason and begged him to please let him stay in this room overnight, that he can't go out there, it's not safe for him. Now, Jason knew he did have some level of responsibility for David. I mean, David had told him he was in danger, he had already invited him inside and was basically providing safe haven for him, and it did feel kind of wrong to be like, now go back out there, but at the same time, Jason felt a little uneasy. I mean, he didn't really know David. He didn't really understand the situation. And so there was some hesitation at first, but after looking again at David and seeing how desperate he was to just please stay here overnight, Jason said, okay, you can stay. So Jason grabbed some extra blankets and pillows and created a makeshift bed on the floor. And then after that, the two of them actually reopened their Bibles and just began reading some more from the Bible for a couple more hours, basically another round of Bible study. But eventually, they both were very tired, so they put their Bibles down, they said goodnight, they each climbed into their beds, and they closed their eyes and fell asleep. For the next 5 days, Jason's motel room remained mostly closed, and the only thing anybody heard coming from his room was gospel music. And it was being played at a very high volume basically the entire time, to the point where other residents of this motel began to complain about how loud the music was. However, the owner of the motel was getting these complaints from residents who were only there for, hours at a time or days at a time. And, the room they're complaining about, Jason's room, he was a long-term resident and so had a sort of higher priority with the owner. And so the owner just didn't feel like bothering Jason. He wanted him to stay and keep paying for that room. So the owner didn't do anything about the noise complaints. And also, the owner did know that his motel had sort of a seedy reputation, and so, generally speaking, he didn't really care too much about the music to begin with. And so over the course of these 5 days, the music kept on blasting, and really the only other thing of note, again, that happened in this period of time, was that these two other people entered Jason's motel room and didn't leave either. So basically there's 4 people in the room, they haven't come out again, super loud music, that's all going on for 5 days. And then on the 5th day, the morning of September 22nd, a single person walked out of Jason's motel room, and they were wearing a full-body hazmat suit and carrying some sort of luggage. And they would leave the motel, get in a car, and drive away. 45 minutes later, about 25 miles away from that motel, the Fort Worth Fire Department got a call about this raging dumpster fire in a residential neighborhood. Firefighters quickly got to the scene and put out the blaze, and after it was gone, they walked up to the smoky dumpster and looked inside just to get a look at what was burning, and what they saw caused them all to back up and call the police. It would turn out David was right when he said he was in danger. However, what he didn't understand is hiding out in Jason's motel room was not going to protect him from that danger. Shortly after he and Jason wrapped up that second Bible study that night, and the two of them climbed into their respective beds, Jason in his actual bed and David in the makeshift bed on the floor, well, David did fall asleep pretty quickly, but Jason didn't. Jason waited until David was asleep, and then Jason got up, got a knife, and then slit David's throat. Then he cut David's heart out and ate it, because Jason the preacher really actually believed that human sacrifice was the best and purest way to serve God. Over the course of the next 5 days after killing David, Jason would remain in his motel room, blasting gospel music, and over those 5 days, he would basically lure those 2 women into his room, very likely on the promise of Bible study, but they too would be sacrificed. And then on the 5th day, the person who exited the motel room in the full hazmat suit was Jason, and that luggage he was carrying with him contained the body parts of the 3 people he had just killed. And he brought those body parts to that dumpster in that residential neighborhood and lit them on fire. And so when the firefighters put out the fire, what they saw inside were burned up bodies. Jason was arrested, and while he was awaiting trial, he confessed that David and the 2 women were not actually his first victims. He said that just a few years earlier, he had sacrificed his girlfriend, and that house fire that destroyed all of his belongings and prompted him to go live in this motel was set by Jason himself, because he had sacrificed his roommate and needed to get rid of the evidence. Ultimately, law enforcement was only able to show that Jason killed those 5 people. But there could have been more. Jason was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Texas. On the evening of Thursday, May 21st, 2015, a 16-year-old girl named Lily walked into the home gym inside of her house in Hong Kong looking to do a workout. Now, she sort of expected the gym would be empty and she could kind of have the run of the place, but as soon as she walked in, she saw her dad was in there and he was doing some sort of cool-down exercise on a yoga ball. So Lily's dad, whose name was Ka Kim Sun, was a doctor and a professional, and normally at this time of the day, she would never see him in the gym. He was typically locked upstairs in his study, or upstairs doing work or something, or he was just gone for the day. So for him to be here, it just didn't really line up with his schedule. And so Lily asked her dad, what are you doing here? What's going on? And her dad would tell her, well, actually, work at the hospital was really slow today, so I took off, I played some tennis with friends, and now I'm just doing some cool down exercises because I got nothing else to do. But I'll be out of your hair in a second. And sure enough, a couple of minutes later, her dad was up and out of the gym, and Lily just began her workout. The next day, May 22nd, around 1 o'clock, Lily was at home at her dining room table, sitting across from her mother, whose name was Wong Siu Fing, and Lily was eating a snack and staring at an open textbook. Now, normally at 1 o'clock on a Friday, Lily would be at school, but she had had the day off that day. And she had wanted to spend her day off seeing friends and just being a teenager, but her dad was really focused on her being successful academically, and he told her that absolutely not. You're not going anywhere. You are going to stay home and you are going to study all day long. You will not leave the house. That's what you're doing. So Lily just continued to stare at the textbook and basically do what her father said. And then a couple of minutes later, she actually heard her dad coming down the stairs, and he came into the dining room, and he was clearly very pleased to see his daughter doing her work, or at least appearing to do her work. And he came over to her, gave her a kiss, he kissed their mother, and then he said he was off to work. And then he went out the door, and he was gone. And as soon as Carl was gone, Lily's mom looked over at her and said, "I'm not going to make you study all day. Come on, let's go out and have a mother-daughter shopping day." And Lily was stoked. She shut her textbook, she went and got ready, and then a minute later, she and her mom climbed into her mom's yellow Mini Cooper car, and they headed out. About 2 hours later, around 4:15 p.m., a local jogger was running in the same neighborhood as where Lily and her family lived, and as they were running down the road, they noticed there was this yellow Mini Cooper car sitting on the side of the road, not moving, but it was still on. It was just sort of idling right there. And at first glance, it appeared there were people inside the car, but they weren't doing anything. They were just sitting there, not moving. And so the jogger was curious, and so they ran past and made a point to look inside the car, and they saw 2 women in the front 2 seats of this car slumped over. The 2 women were Lily and her mother. And so the jogger began to panic and banged on the glass to try to get the women to respond, but they didn't. And so a minute later, police were called. They dragged Lily and her mother out of the car. They were totally unresponsive. They were rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. They both died. The police would begin their investigation into their deaths by searching the yellow Mini Cooper car. And when they searched it, there really was nothing of note inside of it. I mean, the 2 women's purses were in the front of the car, there was some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, but the car was pristine, clean, not cluttered. I mean, there really was nothing in the car that gave away what could have happened to these 2 women. For the next 6 months, the police tirelessly looked for some lead as to what happened to this mother and daughter. They would interview all their friends and family. They would search their house top to bottom. They would basically take apart this Mini Cooper and look for, defects or flaws that maybe could have contributed to their death. I mean, they were looking everywhere, but it just didn't make sense. Nobody had any idea what happened to these two women. And so right as this case appeared like it was about to go cold, the detectives decided to just go back to the Mini Cooper and see if maybe, just maybe, they missed something. And sure enough, they had. It would turn out on May 22nd, 2015, the day that Lily and her mother died, Lily's father had told Lily to stay home and study, not because he cared about her academics. I mean, he did, but that day, the reason for this was not for that. Instead, he wanted her to stay home all day to protect her. When police originally searched Lily's mom's car, they found the two women's purses and also some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, specifically a deflated yoga ball. And at the time, the police didn't think anything of these items. They looked into them, they considered them, but they didn't seem to have any bearing on what happened to the women. However, it would turn out the yoga ball did have something to do with it. Specifically, 2 days before the women were found dead, that yoga ball was inside of Lily's home. It was in her home gym. In fact, when she walked into the home gym and saw her dad doing cool-down exercises and thought it was strange he was home right now, he was using that yoga ball. And Lily didn't think anything of it. But in reality, what her father was doing was not cool-down exercises. He had not just come home early and, had played tennis and this and that. In reality, he had taken that yoga ball to the hospital where he worked and filled it with carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless, poisonous gas. And his plan was to put the yoga ball in his wife's car, unplug it, and now it's sealed and the gas is going to leak inside the car. And then when his wife got in the car and shut the door, she would effectively suffocate and die. He didn't try to kill his daughter, though. He wanted her to stay home and study, i.e., don't go with your mom and get in the car. But the mother defied the father, brought the daughter along, and then after driving for only a mile, the two women collapsed and died. Ka Kim's son was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He has never explained his motive. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen's Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
So tonight I have 2 stories to tell you, and they're great stories, but when I was thinking about how I would go about teasing the stories like I do at the top of these episodes, I couldn't quite think of sort of what the connective tissue was between them. But then I realized really what makes these stories exceptional is that they're both just excellent stories, as I'm getting hit by the heat of this fire, to be told around a campfire. But before we get into those 2 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, go ahead and invite the like button to come to your campfire and cook some s'mores with you. But give them the wrong date and location. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's stories. In the late 1990s, in rural New York, there were these 2 teenage girls named Rachel and Molly, and they were both very good friends. They were part of a bigger group of friends in their high school that sort of spent a lot of time together, but Rachel and Molly oftentimes were together by themselves quite a bit. And the thing that sort of drew the two together and really sort of made them friends in the first place and also drew them to that bigger group was their shared love of goth culture. So being goth, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, if you were like a high school kid, basically meant you wore all black clothes, you had like black, nail polish, black lipstick, your hair's black, you sort of embraced all things dark and macabre. Some people were genuinely very into sort of like the idea of embracing the dark side of things. Other people just did it as like a fashion statement. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was definitely a thing, certainly in America. And Rachel and Molly were both very committed goths, and they just sort of loved that whole vibe. And one of the things that Rachel and Molly really liked to do as goth teenagers is they and their group of friends would go hang out in the local cemetery. Now, at first, the reason they did this was actually to sort of be ironic. It's like they were known as the goth kids in their high school, and so the idea of them hanging out in a cemetery just seemed kind of too on the nose. And so they went out there almost like a joke, the whole group of them. But they found the cemetery was kind of a cool hangout spot, and they began to really enjoy hanging out in the cemetery, and it became sort of like their go-to thing, especially on the weekends. Now, typically when Rachel, Molly, and their friends would go hang out in the cemetery, they would do so at night to sort of maximize, the darkness, really leaning into the whole goth side of things. But also, they would always go as a group. Like it was Rachel, Molly, and several other people that would be in the cemetery hanging out at one time. Like Rachel and Molly did not go there just the two of them. It was always a group. And part of the reason was it was just more enjoyable that way. But also, despite their love of spending time in the cemetery, it was still a cemetery at night, and it was, a little bit creepy. And so there was, strength in numbers, and so they liked being there with a group. It felt safer. One Friday night, Rachel was home alone when she got a call from Molly. And Molly asked her, hey, do you want to go hang out in the cemetery? And Rachel's like, duh, like, that's what we do on the weekends. I'd love to go. Like, come pick me up. Let's go. And so Rachel, she gets all ready and, she's waiting outside, and eventually Molly shows up in her car. And the first thing Rachel notices is that Molly's all alone in the car. She is not with the group that normally she would be with when they picked Rachel up. So Rachel, she walks out to the car and she climbs in and she says to Molly, like, hey, so are we now going to pick up the rest of our friends? Like, where is everybody? And Molly's like, actually, no, I tried getting in touch with everybody else, but everybody's either busy or working or hungover from last night. So it's just going to be us two at the cemetery. Like, is that okay? And Rachel admittedly did not think this was okay. Because again, like, this was not an activity that these girls did by themselves. Rachel was very close with Molly and vice versa. Like, that was fine. It's a little uncomfortable being in the cemetery without the big group. But, Rachel didn't want to be rude. She sort of felt like Molly had already clearly made peace with them being alone out there. And so Rachel's like, oh yeah, that's fine. Like, it'll be great, just the two of us. Like, let's go. And so even though she sort of didn't want to, she gets in the car and they take off and they drive, the half mile to the cemetery. Now, this cemetery was enormous. It was like this massive, very old cemetery. And when you pull up to it, as they did in their car, you would first see this huge, like, medieval gate, like this archway that sort of goes across the entrance to the cemetery. And like the big wrought iron gates, they're sort of permanently open, but it's this very like sort of Gothic looking, archway that you drive through. And then once you're in the cemetery, the road you're on basically cuts down the very middle of the cemetery all the way to the backside. It's a huge, probably like over a mile from one side to the other. And it sort of split the cemetery into two big parts, the right and the left side as you go in. And where they, Molly, Rachel, and their friends loved to hang out was sort of, as you're driving into the cemetery, like the back left corner. And the reason they liked that area is because on the left side of the cemetery, sort of on the left-hand side, there were sort of like rolling hills that all the plots were in. And in particular, in the back left corner of the cemetery, there was like this one depression in the earth where there really weren't that many tombstones, and there was like a big boulder sitting at the bottom of the depression and a tree that was next to it. And so basically, if you were scanning across the top of the cemetery, just from the gate looking out at the entire expanse of land, anybody that was down in that sort of depressed area in the back left corner, you basically couldn't see them. They're sort of tucked away down there with the rock and the tree. And so for, teenagers, for Rachel, Molly, and their friends, that was like a great place to hang out and kind of be away from the prying eyes of the public. And so, Rachel and Molly, they drive through this gate and they make the familiar drive right down the middle of this road all the way to the very back of the cemetery. By this point, it is getting dark outside. It's not totally dark yet, but it's pretty dark. Nobody's out at the cemetery. No one really ever was. Occasionally on the other side of the cemetery, basically on the exact opposite side from where they would hang out, sometimes the college kids that were in town, there was a university in their town, they would sometimes hop the fence on the other side, and there was like a little bonfire section, like right up against the fence in the cemetery. Totally not allowed, but they would sneak over and do that sometimes. But that was sort of rare. But other than those occasional college students over there, the cemetery was basically always vacant. And so they get to the other side, they park their car, they get out, and they walk right from the road, basically right down this it's a gentle sloping hill, but down into this depression, their hangout spot. And once they get down there, there's that big rock and the tree, and they each took up positions sitting on the rock, leaning against the tree, and then just began crushing cigarettes and just hanging out, because that's what goth teenagers in rural New York in the 1990s did. So Rachel and Molly, they're doing their thing. They're having a nice time. They're, swapping stories. They're talking about their boyfriends, about drama at school. And eventually, it gets fully dark outside, and the girls are still just having a nice time. And Rachel's actually thinking to herself, like, actually, this is kind of nice. Like, this isn't scary. This is kind of cool. Like, I'm having, good one-on-one time with my buddy here. But eventually, as they're down there, they start to smell smoke. Now, remember, periodically, on the other side of the cemetery, like pretty far away, was that bonfire area that college kids sometimes would, start bonfires over there. And, when Rachel and Molly had first come into the cemetery, they had looked over there and hadn't seen a fire. But they're thinking, we've been hanging out here for quite a while. It's entirely possible that in the time we've been down here, that those kids have hopped the fence, started a fire, and that's what we're smelling. Now, the fire itself really had no bearing directly on whatever Molly and Rachel were going to do that night. I mean, they're on opposite sides of the cemetery. But Rachel and Molly knew that historically, whenever there was a bonfire over there, eventually the police would always show up, because you're not allowed to do that. And they would kick off, the kids. They'd make them put their fire out. And then always the police would do, a check of the entire cemetery. And anybody that was hanging out in there, like Molly and Rachel were, also got kicked out, even if they were not starting fires. And so Molly and Rachel, they look at each other after smelling this fire, and they both sort of have the same thought, like, we should probably just leave, before the police get here and make us leave. And, after all, they'd been there for quite a while. They were about ready to leave anyhow, so this was like no big deal. So, they put out their last cigarette, they got their stuff, and they turned and began walking back up the hill, back in the direction they had come down on, back in the direction of their car. And as they're walking up, they're expecting to crest the hill and, see their car and see the whole cemetery, and, maybe way off in the distance, maybe they'll see a flicker of the bonfire that they must be smelling. But as they walk up and they see their car and they look out across the cemetery, they don't see a fire over there. Instead, basically right over to their right, like, 100 meters away from them, was another sort of depression in the cemetery, another rolling hill that sort of went down out of sight. And they could see basically the tops of a flickering fire, like in the neighboring depression, like 100 meters away. Now, when they showed up, they were definitely alone on this side of the cemetery. There was nobody else here. And so clearly someone has shown up and started a fire while they were here. And they've never seen any behavior like this. This is like completely unusual. Like, no one starts fires over here. Like, what is that? So the two girls they're curious. Like, did the college kids come over here to start a fire? Because again, they can only see the tops of the flames of this fire down in this neighboring depression. They can't see the person or people who are around it, but they're thinking like, the people over there have no idea that we are over here. And so the two girls are like, well, what if we kind of go back down to where we were and sneak up the far side of our sort of hilled in area and poke our heads over and like see whose fire this is? You know, we'll see the college kids and see what they're doing. We can like spy on them or something. And the two girls are like, yeah, why not? We're already here. And so the two girls, they turn around, they walk back down into the base of their depression where the big rock and the tree was that they were just sitting on for the past couple of hours. And they walk past it basically to the other side and begin walking up that hill. And as they're getting closer and closer to the top of this hill, when eventually, once they reach the top, they could peer over and see the fire and see whoever was there. Right as they got almost to the top, Rachel sort of unintentionally makes some noise, like the way she was walking, and she sort of made a sound as she stepped on something, but she accidentally makes a fair amount of noise. And the only noise in the area was the sound of the fire. Like they hadn't heard any voices yet. And so Rachel, she just covers her mouth and looks over at Molly, and Molly kind of looked at her like, what are you doing? Like, we're sneaking up on these people. Like, why are you making noise? And the two girls, they just freeze for a second, waiting to see if, you know, whoever was over there heard them and sort of reacted to the noise Rachel made. But it was silent, sort of eerily silent. And at this point, Rachel and Molly, it was like the mood just shifted. Like they had not reached the top of the hill yet. They had not seen whoever was at this fire. But it was like something just felt wrong now. And the two girls looked at each other and they're like, maybe we should just turn around and leave. And they both were like, yeah, let's get out of here. Like, this doesn't feel right. And so right then and there, the two girls, as quietly as they could, turned and retreated back down to the center of the depression where the rock and the tree was, and they begin walking back up the original side of the hill in the direction of where their car is parked at the top. And as they're walking up, Rachel just happens to turn back around where they had just been, just to look in the direction of where they had just been. And now she sees there is clearly a man standing on the ridgeline with the fire behind him, illuminating him, and he's just standing there sort of ominously staring in the direction of Rachel and Molly. And he's just not saying a word, he's just looking in their direction. Clearly he was the one over at the fire. He must have heard them. And Rachel, she whips around and she's like, Molly, look. And Molly looks and she's like, let's get out of here. We don't know who that guy is, like we gotta get out of here. And so Rachel and Molly, they begin quickly walking up the hill. And then a second later, Rachel turns back around and the man is no longer on the hill, but then she sees movement and she realizes he's running down the hill in their direction. And so the girls start screaming, they start running up the hill. Rachel's constantly looking around and this guy's gaining on them. They get to the top of the hill, they charge over to Molly's car, they jump inside, they lock the doors, they fire it up and they drive off. And as they're driving, Rachel's looking out the back window and she sees this man basically looking. He's reached the road, like he almost got to them. And he was looking in their direction. And as they drove off, he just slowly turned and walked back down the hill out of sight. And so Rachel and Molly, they're like totally shaken up by this. Like clearly that wasn't a college kid. Like that was a 40-something-year-old man who they had never seen before. Like the whole situation just felt totally just creepy and spooky, and they really didn't know what to make of it. They sort of felt like what could have happened if he reached us? Like what was he trying to do? Like what just happened? But ultimately, when they got home, or when Molly dropped Rachel off at her house, the two girls were sort of like, man, that was crazy, huh? You know, they kind of like chalked it up as like just a crazy night, you know, like, oh boy, we better, you know, stay out of there alone at night, you know, like it was just sort of a joke by the time they were done for the night. And so Rachel, you know, she goes into her house, doesn't even tell her mom. She just, you know, puts her stuff down, goes to her room, and Molly, she went to her house, and she too didn't even tell anyone. She went to bed as well. The next morning, Rachel woke up and she went downstairs into the kitchen, and her mom was in there. And her mom was just kind of doing her morning routine. And when she saw Rachel come in, she said to Rachel, like, hey, how was your night last night? And Rachel was like, oh, you know, it was fine. Me and Molly went out. It was fine. No big deal. And her mom was like, oh, did you hear what happened last night? And Rachel's like, no, what do you mean? What happened? And her mom was like, well, a woman in our town got kidnapped. And she got kidnapped from the very parking garage where I park. Like she worked in the same building as me. She got kidnapped. And Rachel's like, oh my God, like what happened to her? Like, did they find her? And Rachel's mom is like, no, unfortunately, it was too late. When they found her, she was dead. And in fact, whoever kidnapped and then killed her brought her body last night to the local cemetery and burned her in this huge bonfire. And whoever did it still hasn't been caught. And when Rachel heard this, it was like her whole world came crashing down, because suddenly she understood what had happened the night before. That fire was no ordinary fire. That was the killer that chased them down the hill. That fire very likely contained the woman who had been killed. They were right next to this person, this killer, and this horrible thing happening. And even more creepy is like, they were there very likely when the killer arrived, set up shop, and began burning this body, no more than 100 meters away from them. And what would have happened if that man who chased them, what would have happened if he caught them? And so Rachel, she pours her heart out to her mom and tells her everything that happened the night before. And her mom is like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. You have to tell the police because they haven't caught this guy. Like, you have a description of him. Like, go talk to the police. And so sure enough, Rachel, she gets in touch with Molly and, tells Molly what happened. And Molly's totally in hysterics. They can't believe what a close call this was. And they do go to the police. They tell them, to the best of their ability, what they remember about this guy, which unfortunately was not much. It was like he was average height, he looked to be maybe in his 40s. Like, there wasn't much to their description. But fortunately, just 48 hours later, the police were able to catch this guy and he would make a full confession. Luckily, 2 days later, not really because of the girl's description at all, but just sort of by luck alone, the police happened to see the victim's car in town. Somebody was driving the victim's car around, and so they pulled this person over. It wound up being the killer who, after being arrested, did make a full confession. And so, needless to say, Rachel and Molly, when they think about what happened that night in the cemetery, they feel very fortunate that Rachel sort of inadvertently made noise on their approach to go spy on the fire, which ultimately caused them both to sort of rethink their decisions and turn around and leave. It very likely saved their life. Because if that hadn't happened and they had gone over the hill and had been confronted by the killer, it's entirely possible that both those girls could have wound up in the bonfire as well. So before I became Mr. Ballen and, told stories on the internet, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, I was in the military. I was a Navy SEAL for 7 years. And there was a time where I believed that was going to be my calling in life. But I ultimately got hurt, and honestly, it wasn't really a fit. So I wound up departing, and then obviously the rest is history. I became Mr. Ballen. But, I have lots of stories about my time when I was in the military. I have lots of really funny stories about training and scary stories, about my actual service overseas. But one story that has always stood out to me was actually what it was like to deploy for the very first time to Afghanistan. And this is not really a war story, and that's why this story sort of stands out to me. So, I spend years, literally almost 3 years training and becoming a Navy SEAL. And then it's like, okay, I get to my SEAL team on the East Coast in Virginia. And, so SEAL Team 2 is where I was. And we start training for our deployment, and we find out it's going to be to Afghanistan. And, this is back in 2013. And so, going to Afghanistan likely meant combat. In that time, there was still definitely active combat operations happening. And for Navy SEALs and for any direct combat unit, you do want to go to war, not because you are like a warmonger, but because that's what you train for. And so it's like, okay, like I'm getting ready for combat. And then the day comes, and the way you deploy is, this is not unique to Navy SEALs, but like they don't send you out to wherever you're going in one group because it's sort of risky. What if a plane crashes and your whole platoon gets wiped out, right? So you get sent out in like little batches, like sometimes on civilian flights. Like I flew first to South America with like a couple other SEALs. We're all dressed as civilians. And then we hitched a military transit flight actually into Afghanistan. But again, like my mentality as I'm getting ready for this deployment is like, okay, like this is the thing I've trained for. Like, here we go, like combat. And I remember I was on this military plane. This is the last leg actually getting into Afghanistan. And when we actually flew into Afghani airspace, which is an active war zone at the time, the pilots, the military pilots, they turned the lights inside of the aircraft from the white overhead, like, daytime lights, to red. And then they told all of us to stay away from the windows. And the reason was, like, we're now entering, the part of this trip where we're going to land. And in theory, the plane could get shot at. You don't want to get shot at through the window. And I mean, if you think about it, if you're getting blasted by like an RPG, it's not going to matter that like you're near a window or not. But it was sort of this stark reminder that it's like, okay, here we go. Like, we're about to enter a war zone. And then the way these planes would land is they needed to basically cut down the amount of time they were within small arms range. So the lower you get, the more, sort of exposed the plane is. And so the way they'd land is they would take these really steep descents and basically like fly straight down and then land really abruptly. It was like sort of gnarly. And so we're coming in for this crazy landing. The red lights are on. Everyone's tucked away from the windows. And I'm like, okay, we're getting ready for Afghanistan. And we touch down and, it's a successful landing. And now we're in this like pretty well fortified base. Shank is what it was called. And I remember the back of the plane opened up after, we sort of had stopped taxiing, we came to a stop and the back of the plane opened up. And remember, my mentality is like, okay, we're going to war, right? And I grabbed my pack. The rest of my stuff had been packed on pallets and sent, weeks prior. So all I have is a backpack. And me and a buddy of mine, another guy on my team, we walk out the runway. And we basically see Afghanistan really for the first time, because I really had the windows on the airplane, by the way, were like these little portholes. You really never got a good look, not to mention we had to avoid the windows. So this is like my first view of Afghanistan. And I remember just like looking around and it was just unbelievably beautiful. Like, Afghanistan is shockingly beautiful. It's in every direction, 360 degrees, these just enormous, like massive snow-covered mountains and just beautiful fields. It's like untouched land. And like, we're in the middle of this like jagged scar across the earth, which is this like NATO base where war is sort of launched out of. But it's like you're looking around at just this unbelievably beautiful place. And it was like in such contrast to what I believed I was coming here for, or what I was there for, like to fight in a war. And it just like didn't compute. Like, this is too beautiful a place to be having a war fought. But I mean, very quickly after sort of seeing this environment and being like, oh my gosh, we were quickly ushered over to this like holding area and we had to grab our stuff. And then before long, we had jumped into these very up-armored military vehicles called RGs, which are like 50,000 ton anti-IED vehicles. Basically, if it detonates underneath you, in theory, you'll survive. And out we go, from the base we were on out to this like very forward operating base that was sort of out in the sticks. And it was like sort of a vulnerable spot. And it was where we were going to be operating from for the next 6 months. Our mission was pretty vulnerable. We were out sort of actually actively fighting the war. But that first night we get to our actual base, this very stripped down, like very vulnerable spot out in the middle of nowhere. And when we got there, there were, the previous team was still there. They were wrapping up their deployment. And there were interpreters who are a central part of the warfighting effort, from our side. And a lot of these interpreters who are pretty young, like in their 20s, like they've been out there working with various units that have come through those bases for years. And because they're working with NATO, they don't have a place outside of the base. Like, they're targeted by the Taliban and other sort of militant groups because, they're working for NATO. They're traitors, And so the great promise for these interpreters is that by working with NATO, eventually they'll be given the opportunity to leave Afghanistan and come to the United States. And for some people that's true. Not true for everybody, but these interpreters are like hard as nails. They've been in so many gunfights. Like, these people have seen some crazy stuff. And my role was to work with these interpreters. I was going to be someone that worked with our partner force. And so I get to this little outstation. It's late at night and it's sort of overwhelming, this whole thing. The team that was already there, SEAL Team 8, they were like, so like cowboy by this point. They'd been in combat now for the last 6 months. They're all just like jacked and huge beards. Like, they could care less about anything. and I'm like super green. And I went and I met with one of our interpreters to like sort of give me a lay of the land of what to expect over the next couple of days. And so we talked about some operations we'd likely do and sort of, got to know each other a little bit. But at some point, one of these interpreters, the guy I was talking to, who maybe was like 25, 26, and I was in my 20s too, he said to me, he goes, bro, and they all talk in like Western slang. Like their English is like rugged, like American military slang, because they're around like 18-year-old Marines 24/7. He's like, bro, have you heard the story of what was in the cave in Kandahar? Now, we were in a different part of Afghanistan, but he was referencing Kandahar, Afghanistan. And what I would come to find out is there was this story about a giant, like a creature, some huge creature that lived in a cave out in the mountains of Kandahar. And like Afghanistan, again, is this huge, just like mountains everywhere. And there are all these cave systems up in these mountains, some of which are like untouched by humanity. And this chirp was like, bro, I'm telling you, it's real. Like there was a giant up in the caves in Kandahar. Like, have you heard about this? Like, I want to know more. The interpreter did. And so, we didn't really talk much more than that, but it was planted in my mind that there was like this real belief by this interpreter that there was like some truth to this, what sounded like sort of a folklore, this crazy story about a giant in a cave. And so it stuck with me. It stuck with me that I'd heard that story. Fast forward, years later, I'm out of the military, and I've become MrBallen. I've begun telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories on the internet. And I was thinking about what stories I wanted to tell. This is like in the very early days of having the channel, and I suddenly remembered like the Kandahar giant, and I was like, man, I want to look into that and see if there's any truth to what my interpreter was getting at. And sure enough, I found like this treasure trove of testimony from this special operations group, the Green Berets, that apparently did. Like this one particular group of Green Berets that apparently came in touch with something otherworldly up in the caves of Kandahar. And in particular, there was one soldier who just went by Mr. K because he was worried about his name getting out there, who gave just like shocking testimony about what they saw. And so I felt like I needed to do this story justice. I wanted to sort of compile the notes and put together a story that, sort of picked up where my interpreter had began. And I told the story years and years ago. And tonight, I'm going to tell you that story again. So in 2002, there was this Army infantry unit that was out doing a patrol in the Kandahar mountain range. And again, you got to picture just massive snow-covered mountains. I mean, this is a huge area. And, a lot of times in 2002, these patrols, you'd be sort of looking potentially for cave systems where Taliban fighters would be camping out, or, sometimes there'd be fighters that were down in the valleys below. But these patrols were fairly routine for NATO in 2002. And so this unit, they're out on patrol, and generally the way it works, really independent of what branch of the military you're in the US military, when you're out on patrol, you basically update some level of higher command as you're doing the operation. And also, by the way, virtually no operations, no matter how routine or mundane, like no operations aren't planned out. Like everything is planned. Like what time you get there, how long you're going to be there, what you're trying to do, when you're going to leave, what platform you're going to use to leave. Like everything is really coordinated. And so this unit, they went out, for the umpteenth time to do this patrol. And at some point in the middle of this patrol, the higher command lost contact with them. And the reason this immediately stood out as problematic is, it wasn't totally unusual for a group to lose comms. I mean, you're trying to communicate across huge mountain ranges, using, these radios that are really a lot of times not that great. And so losing comms is not that unusual. But generally speaking, like a lot of times if you lose comms, you get it back pretty quickly. And so there had been a pretty long period of time where no one could get in touch with this unit. And then on top of that, as higher command was beginning to figure out like what we should do here, should we send out a quick reaction force to go find them? Should we send, air assets overhead to go try to look for them that way? As they're thinking about that, somebody realized that not only had they suddenly gone silent, this huge infantry unit, but also they had not called in a tick before they went silent. So a tick, or troops in contact is the acronym for basically being in a gunfight. And the reason this is important is, when you're in a combat zone, your higher command doesn't automatically know if you're getting shot at or if you're in an active gunfight. You need to call it in. And the reason you call it in is because you may need huge help. You might want air assets to come in and save the day. You might need a medevac. You might need reinforcements. And so basically, the instant you start getting shot at, commanders on the ground, or whoever's on the ground, could be someone super junior, they'll call into higher command and say, troops in contact, tick, 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 tick. And the reason they do that is basically to have help on standby. Now they're like, okay, we know something's going down, we're ready to support. And in fact, what we saw when we were in Afghanistan is, if anything, we were like too quick to call in a tick, because it's sort of like a cheat code, right? Like, oh, I think I heard gunfire way over there, call in a tick. And then immediately you got like warthogs overhead and crazy assets everywhere, like you're totally protected. Well, we sort of took advantage of it. And a lot of people did. Like, it's rare for the reverse to happen. Like, people are not conservative calling this in. And so for an entire unit to suddenly go like silent, having not called in a tick, it's either a huge like radio problem, but that usually gets resolved relatively quickly, or it's something else, something that is just harder to define because it just doesn't really happen very much. And so after a certain amount of time had passed, when still no one could get in touch with this unit, ultimately the Army decided this was, a big enough deal. There was enough people in that unit that were now unaccounted for, that they decided to send in an elite military unit to try to find them. And so they tapped this Green Beret unit. So the Army's top special forces team, the Green Berets, they grabbed a group of those guys and said, you go out into the mountains of Kandahar to their last known location and figure out what happened to them. And one of the people that was in this detachment of Green Berets was Mr. K, one of the people that gave pretty incredible testimony that I'm about to relay to you right now. So Mr. K and the rest of his small group of Green Berets, they hop on helicopters and they fly out to this section of Kandahar where, this infantry unit was last. And they touch down, and you got to understand that this is like rural as rural can be. There is, no people. Like, there's no cities, no nothing. There's like mud huts periodically, but it's just like mountains. You kind of feel like sometimes when you're in Afghanistan that you're like almost on a different planet. And so they touch down and they look around and they see nobody. Like, there's no locals. There's certainly no American military or NATO. It's just like a wasteland in all directions. And they know that the area they're searching is pretty sizable and it's very mountainous. So it's going to be like a very rough several days of basically hiking through the mountains trying to find any sign of this unit. And so they touch down and they all have like extremely heavy packs on. I mean, you got all your ammo, your equipment. Like, this is a rugged thing they're doing. And they start hiking through the mountains. Based on the brief that unit had given before they stepped out for this mission, they sort of had a rough idea, Mr. K and his unit, of the direction of travel. And so they're sort of following that direction. But as they're hiking through the mountains, I mean, the unit that Mr. K was a part of, they didn't find anybody. And for several days, I mean, they're out there in the mountains just hiking all day. They came into contact a couple of times with the enemy, but there wasn't even any ticks or anything. It was just like at a distance, like, oh, there's some fighters over there. But they're on a mission to find these missing soldiers. So they're not trying to engage with anybody else. Like, they're just hiking and looking for any sign of this unit. But again, for a few days, they couldn't find anything. Finally, though, on the fourth day of this rescue mission, so during the daytime, Mr. K and his team, they're walking along the mountain range, and they decide to take this goat trail that they can see right ahead of them. It sort of goes up and over the top of this mountain. They decide, okay, we're just going to take that goat trail and see what's on the other side. There wasn't any clear agenda for why this goat trail was of interest, but they're like, oh, everywhere else we're walking is just rugged and awful. At least this goat trail, a literal trail made by goats running along this area, is easier to walk on. So let's take that, we'll follow it to the other side, and we'll see what's up there. And also we'll be up higher and we can maybe get a view down into the valley on the other side, and maybe we'll see something. And so Mr. K and the rest of the Green Berets begin making their way up this goat trail, which sort of, meandered its way up and then eventually onto the other side. And as they're walking up, they start to notice these little bits of plastic and metal sort of strewn about on the trail. And at first, as they're walking, they don't actually know what they are. But as they keep moving, they start to realize that these are parts of military equipment. Like these are parts of radios and other stuff that would definitely belong to, for example, an infantry unit. And so now, like Mr. K and the others, they got their rifles sort of ready to go. They're walking up more apprehensively because they're thinking like, this is obviously connected to what we're looking for. Like, who knows what we're gonna find once we cross the top of this mountain? Like, are we gonna find like a bloodbath? Are we gonna find the missing unit waiting for us? Like, they don't know. And so they continue walking up this trail, and as they get higher and higher, they find bigger and bigger pieces of military equipment on the ground, like whole military backpacks, like bigger chunks of radios. And then also they began finding bits of uniform, like military uniforms that even in some cases still had like name tags and patches on them. And they were able to see very clearly that those uniforms, at least, definitely belonged to the specific unit they were looking for. So they know, like, they've discovered their first real lead here, and it doesn't look good. And so up the goat trail they go, and they finally get to the very top. And I say this, I'm trying not to be biased because obviously I was a Navy SEAL and I think very highly of U.S. Special Operations and their training. But, Green Berets and Navy SEALs, they're very different and definitely do different jobs. But in many ways, they are peers, certainly in terms of like the rigor of training. And one of the things that is just absolutely true, and I've seen it in combat, is that when stuff gets wild, like in a combat scenario, in a dangerous scenario, these Green Berets would have absolutely fallen into their training like flawlessly. This would not have been, no matter how crazy or how insane whatever they saw on the other side of the mountain, whatever it was going to be, they were ready for it. And so they would have been like dialed in, making their way up the mountain, getting ready to handle whatever's up there. And so, Mr. K and his team, they make their way to the very top of this goat trail. And when they crested the top, what they saw was like this plateau. So it wasn't like a peak, it was like this flat section of the mountain. And actually there was another section of the mountain that sort of went up beyond the plateau, and there were these huge like cave entrances that sort of basically fed out. These 3 cave entrances fed out onto this plateau, as if it was like the plateau was the front porch and the cave entrances are like the doors that lead into this upper section of the mountain. And on this plateau, scattered all over the place, is not just, more pieces of military equipment, but also pretty obviously human bones, or what appeared to be human bones, like scattered about. And there was, no living people up here. The missing unit was definitely not up here. But it looked like if they were up here, something horrible happened to them. And so once they reached the plateau, again, you got a picture like this elite military unit, they would have immediately taken up positions all around this plateau because they know these cave entrances have to be explored. You have to see who's inside of there. Like, is the missing unit in there? Are the remaining survivors taking shelter in there? Are there combatants in there? And so Mr. K and his unit, they sort of detailed taking up positions, getting ready to engage if they had to. And then once they were in position, Mr. K and the guy he was next to, his shooting buddy, if you will, were tapped to go up to the entrance of one of these caves and just look inside. And so silently they got up and they walked across this plateau while the rest of the team is sort of looking outward and also looking in. So there's 360-degree security. So Mr. K, he walks up along with his shooting buddy, and he said he looked into this entrance, this huge, massive entrance, like could easily just walk into this opening, but it's totally dark inside. And so he goes into the cave. And once he gets in there, like it's very dark, and he's sort of trying to look inside to see if he can see anything. And it does go back a little ways, but he barely takes a couple of steps into the cave when he realizes like there's like this sheer cliff within the cave. Like you basically walk in and then it shoots straight down. And Mr. K, he caught himself and he looked down to see if he could see what was down sort of in this pit within the cave, but it was just too dark, he couldn't see anything. And then, like as he's standing back up again, getting ready to sort of assess what he should do next, he sees like a flash of movement in the far backside of the cave, basically beyond this crevasse that he can't cross. And so Mr. K instinctively raises his gun like he's ready to engage whatever this is, but before he can, this enormous spear, like a massive javelin, comes soaring out of the cave and impales the shooting buddy. His name was Dan, the other Green Beret that was next to Mr. K, who went up to explore the cave. The spear impales him, sends him flying back, and this is in plain view of all the other Green Berets. They all see this happen, and then like in the space of a few seconds, this massive, just enormous human creature, this like 12-foot tall thing, comes bounding out of the cave, clears the crevasse, and charges out onto the plateau. And it sort of looked like a huge person, but again, it's like 12 feet tall. It's got 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. It's wearing various animal skins, got this huge red hair, red beard, and it runs out to, presumably attack the Green Berets. But immediately they just start shooting it, and in like seconds, this massive creature falls to the ground, dead. And so at this point, like after the creature is down, I mean, nobody knows what to make of this, but again, it's like they fall back into their training. They immediately, once they know the threat is down and there's nobody else coming out of the cave, they run over to Dan to provide, life-saving care. But Dan's dead. I mean, he was killed by this javelin. And so now the team, they poked their head into the cave to make sure there wasn't anybody else, but as far as they knew, there wasn't. And for sure, this giant was dead, and so like they hadn't found the missing military unit, but now they have a casualty, and like they have this horrible thing that's happened. And so one of the team leads for this Green Beret team, they end up calling higher command, and they say, hey, you got to come get us. Like, we can't even tell you what just happened, but we have a man down, killed in action, and we have this combatant, this creature, we don't even know what to call it, but you got to get out here, and you got to take this thing too. We don't even know what it is. And so not long after, 2 helos showed up, and one of them was to transport the Green Berets and to transport Dan back to the base. And then the other helo had this huge net that they basically wrapped around this dead, huge giant, and they strapped it up to the underside of the helo, and then they flew off with this giant. And, Mr. K and his unit, they expected to be brought back to base and to basically debrief the mission, which, in layman's terms means you basically talk through what actually happened and you sort of put it down in your after action report, like what happened, what mistakes were made, what did we do, like you basically put it on the record, like what happened. And you do it typically like right afterwards. Even if you've had like a casualty, you immediately document what's happened. And so they go back to base expecting not only to tell their story about seeing this giant, if you will, but to maybe get some clarification about what the heck just happened. Like, they wanted some more information, but when they got back to base and they did their after action report, which they sort of did on their own, nobody came to talk to them. The unit was sort of pushed off to the side and told to just, write down what you saw and just leave it at that. After they wrote it all down and they included, the truth, everybody on the team saw what they saw, they were told by higher command that they actually could not publish those details in their after action report, and they had to change it. Like we can't say you fought a giant in a cave. We can't say that. Like there's no way that's true. You can't say it. And so Mr. K and his team, like despite knowing it wasn't true, they went and they changed the report, and they just said they came in contact with the enemy, and the enemy, through small arms fire, killed Dan. And then after they submitted this, erroneous report, they were then told to sign all these non-disclosure agreements to basically say they would not talk about what they actually saw in that cave. And after that, Dan and the rest of his unit, they were basically told, you can't talk about this. This is too sensitive. And they even went looking for more information about it. And they found that all of the reporting in Afghanistan around that time about that operation had been heavily redacted. Mr. K never even found out what happened to the missing unit that they had gone out looking for. Like it was just this big mystery. But fast forward 14 years to 2016, and Mr. K just felt like he didn't want to keep this a secret anymore. And he spoke to some other members of his team that were there, and they too were just like really shaken up by what happened and just felt like it was wrong that nobody knew. And so that's what ultimately prompted Mr. K to go public with his story. And also when he went public, what he also discovered is that other people sort of in the military hierarchy also had some level of exposure to this giant. What Mr. K would discover is that after the giant had been hoisted in that net by that helo and flown off somewhere, apparently it had been brought to an airfield in Afghanistan, another NATO base, and pilots that were going to be transporting this to another base remember seeing this 12 to 15 foot tall, giant looking person with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot in this net. They remember seeing it and actually describing it in their after action report. And they would say they were told not to include those details. And those details were redacted and made top secret. And so basically, Mr. K, after coming forward, quickly learned through the grapevine that basically everybody affiliated with the giant was told not to talk about it. And the government basically shut it down, redacted it, and made it top secret. Now, I don't really know what to make of this story. There's a part of me that does want to believe that, the testimony of Mr. K is totally legitimate. But there's also a part of me that knows that, this could all just be made up. But a lot of people claim to have seen this thing. And I remember so distinctly, my own interpreter back in 2013 being so convinced that there was something in the caves in Kandahar, and he really wanted to know more about it. It's like, there's some level of truth to this. I mean, I was, in Afghanistan, and I was in the mountains of Afghanistan, not Kandahar. I was in Logar. But I mean, we used to walk by and look up and see these cave entrances, and I gotta tell you, it's unsettling. I mean, who knows what's inside of those things? It doesn't seem entirely impossible that a giant could be in there, Like this is a landscape that's just, it's different. It's like a different planet out there. But, I mean, really what you're left with here is you have an entire infantry unit that's still unaccounted for, at least publicly, and you have an Army Green Beret in Dan who was killed in front of his team, and they want answers. And, it's like what you see is the government apparently went to great lengths to cover up what happened, or to at least disguise the truth. Whether or not they're covering something up remains to be seen, but I think there's more to this story that we simply don't know. But I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, so why don't you let me know in the comments and I'll get back to as many people as I can.
Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never before heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows.
All right, thank you all so much for joining me tonight at the campfire. And if you enjoyed this, remember, we actually have a whole playlist of campfire episodes that are ready for you to binge right now. If you want to do that, go ahead and click right here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to bring the like button's car in for a service. But make sure when you have it there, you ask them to replace the air in their tires with helium. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the evening of December 14th, 2024, a woman in her mid-30s named Priya got ready for bed inside of her home in Chehenkalo village, which is a rural community in central India. Priya put on her PJs, brushed her teeth, and then climbed into bed by herself. She was waiting for her husband, 35-year-old Anand Yadav, to finish his bath and then come in here and join her. And as Priya laid there, just waiting for her husband, she couldn't help but feel like their house was so quiet. And in many ways, the quiet of their house was this constant reminder of this really deep sadness in her life, which is, Priya really wanted a kid, but she and her husband had struggled to get pregnant. And now, they're in their mid-30s and it just seemed like time was running out. And, it's like all she wanted was a family and she didn't know if she would actually have one. Now, for Priya, though, this was not some new revelation. Like, this pain had been going on for years. And so, like she did most nights, as she laid in bed waiting for her husband, she just did her best, not to dwell on it and just think about the other things in her life that were going well, like, her relationship to her husband They were very happy and a very healthy couple. And so she's sitting there and she's thinking about that and again, trying to be grateful when the door opens to the bathroom and Anand comes out. But he's not dressed for bed. He's wearing a bathrobe, like he hasn't gotten dressed yet. And he's acting kind of funny. And Priya, she's looking at her husband, trying to figure out, like, what is he doing? Why isn't he dressed? What's going on here? When she suddenly realizes his face is like bright red. Clearly, there is something wrong with her husband. And then before she can ask him what's going on, Anand just turns and runs out of their bedroom, just wearing his bathrobe. And so Priya, she gets out of bed and she chases after her husband, trying to make sense of what the heck is going on here. She gets outside and she sees her husband is now collapsed on the ground outside. And so Priya really does not know what's happening here. She has no sense of what could be wrong. And so she just runs over to her husband and she rolls him over and she's shaking him to get him to talk to her. But all she sees is his face is still this beet red color and it's almost like he's passed out or something, like he's not responsive. And so really having no clue what else to do, she just rushed next door to her relative's house. She got some family members, they came outside and together they scooped up the non-responsive Anand, threw him in a vehicle, and they rushed him to the hospital. And when they got to the hospital, Priya leapt out of the car, leaving Anand and her family behind, and she bolts inside. She tells the front desk attendant what's going on, that her husband, he's not breathing, he's unresponsive, he's in the car. And so right away, medical staff came charging out. They went and they got Anand, they brought him inside, and before long, Priya is running behind all the doctors and nurses that are rushing Anand on a gurney through the hospital to an exam room. They get in the exam room, and even though Priya, she's kind of off to the side, she can't really see what's going on, but she can see the doctor who is primarily trying to figure out what's wrong with Anand. And she sees at first he's kind of doing a couple things to see if he can get Anand to start reacting to him, but pretty quickly she sees this doctor just kind of sit back, and there's this look of pity that comes over his face. And he turns and he looks over at Priya and he tells her that, unfortunately, your husband is dead. Now for Priya, this whole thing has happened so quickly that it's almost like she can't even begin to process it. And so instead of, becoming hysterical with grief, her first thought is, how could he have died? Anand was a healthy guy. He's, 35 years old. He's in the best shape of his life. He's a happy guy with a robust social life. There's no reason he should be dying right now. What in the world happened here? What killed him? That's her question to the doctor. But the doctor said, I don't know. The only way we're going to be able to figure out what happened here is to do an autopsy, because there's just nothing obvious. And so sure enough, a couple of days later, the hospital's pathologist was, inside of an exam room with Anand's body laying on a table right in front of him. And this pathologist had done countless autopsies. This was, very standard work for this doctor. And so the pathologist, they went into this autopsy really not having any idea what killed this guy, but in their head they were thinking, okay, maybe it was a sudden heart attack, because this sort of seems like that could be it. And so they made their first incision on Anand's chest, and the first place they went to look was Anand's heart. But after looking at Anand's heart, they determined that no, he did not go into cardiac arrest, he did not die from a heart attack, this death was not connected to his heart. And so the pathologist naturally moved from the heart to Anand's lungs, which is another area that, he believed could have something to do with this death. But after checking those out, it was clear the lungs did not have to do with Anand's death. And so after that, the pathologist wound up checking all of Anand's organs, trying to find any sign of what killed him, but there was nothing. There was no indication that this guy should have died. Now, the pathologist was a little bit surprised, because they figured, by this point, they would have had the answer of what happened to him, but it's no matter. They'd done many autopsies before where it required some, further looking to figure out what happened. And so they moved on and they made an incision in Anand's throat. And when they opened up Anand's throat, the pathologist just stepped back and gasped, because in their entire career, they had never, ever seen anything like this. It would turn out that Priya was not the only one who felt deep sadness around not having a family yet. Anand as well was just really heartbroken over the idea that, he was never going to become a father. And so, without telling his wife, Anand had gone out and sought out professional help for their fertility issues. However, the type of professional help that he sought was a little bit unorthodox. Instead of going to see a licensed doctor, Anand went to see what's called a tantric, which is basically a practitioner of occult magic. And this tantric gave Anand instructions for how to perform this ritual that supposedly guaranteed, if he did it correctly, that he would be able to have his child. Anand clearly believed this tantric, and so after being given the instructions, he went out and gathered the necessary resources, and he took them home. And then on the night that he died, while Priya was in bed waiting for him, and he was in the bathroom, taking his bath or whatever, well, at some point in the bathroom, Anand performed this fertility ritual, and it killed him. Anand, per the tantric's instructions, had taken a living baby chicken, a chick, and attempted to swallow it whole. Apparently that was all he needed to do in order to have a child, as he so desperately wanted. But when he swallowed this chick, it got stuck in his throat, and within minutes, he suffocated to death. And also, unfortunately, the chick died as well. One morning in late November of 1979, a 64-year-old man named John Perrin walked through a park near his home in East London, South Africa, which is a small coastal town. The park was basically a forested area that ran right along the coastline, so even though John was walking on a trail through all these trees, he could literally hear the ocean waves crashing down on the beach below. And being out here was actually a pretty big deal for John, because he didn't come to this park very often. In fact, he pretty much never left his house, because John was a total recluse. And, in addition to not leaving his house, he basically spoke to nobody. He didn't have friends, didn't have family. He basically had this one cousin he spoke to sometimes on the phone, but that was it. This guy was very isolated. But today, something in John had told him to go outside and go to this park and take a walk. It was just like this kind of weird intuition that he couldn't even explain. But he just hadn't questioned it, and here he was, doing what his gut was telling him to do. So now, he followed the trail through the woods and listened to the ocean down below, and he eventually went around this bend, and when he did, he saw there was somebody on the trail up ahead. It was this young man who John had never seen before, and this young man looked really anxious. He was sort of pacing back and forth on the trail, like he was trying to maybe build up the nerve to do something. At least that's what John's first impression was. Now, to John, this guy did not feel like a threat to him. It just seemed sort of odd what he was doing, and so John was curious, and so he continued walking down the trail closer to this guy to see what was happening here. Remember, John thinks he's here for some really divine reason in some ways. He doesn't really know what it is. He thinks his gut intuition has brought him here. Maybe it's this guy. And so he's walking down the trail, sizing up what he's doing. And as he gets closer to this man who's pacing back and forth, John realizes that the man is sort of pacing up to the edge of this cliff. Basically, again, this park sits right on the coastline, but the coastline is way down below. And John realizes this guy is pacing back and forth to the cliff and then going back over to the cliff and then back. And this is a massive drop off. This cliff is all the way down to the beach, easily a fatal fall if you were to fall off the cliff. And suddenly it clicks for John. This young man is contemplating taking his own life. He's working up the courage to jump off the cliff. At least that's what John is thinking. The young man is so locked in on what he's doing, he's barely even registering that John is here. He's still just pacing, building up the courage, again, it appeared, to jump off this cliff. And so John's standing there, not really sure what to do. And also there were these other people that were also on the trail that had sort of taken notice of the situation. And there was this crowd forming, sort of standing a little bit back of this young man, not wanting to unintentionally, startle him and get him to jump off the cliff. Everyone's just kind of standing there watching. But for John, as he's standing there, almost paralyzed, not knowing what to do, he's watching this guy go back and forth. And then it was like everything clicked. Suddenly, John understood why he was here. His gut instinct had brought him here to go up and interact with this young man. And so John broke from the crowd. He walked up to this young man who was still pacing back and forth, and he put his arm around the young man, and he looked at him and he said, "I'll show you how it's done." And then John walked to the edge of the cliff and jumped. And the young man was so shocked by this that he just stood there and he watched as John plummeted down to the beach below and smashed into the ground and died. And this young man, I mean, he's so horrified by this, so shocked, that he decided he wasn't going to jump after all. Seeing it happen, seeing John do the thing that this young man was there to do, to jump off this cliff, to take his own life, to see somebody else do it was so awful that he decided not to do it. And so as he's having this revelation, the young man also distinctly felt grateful to John, for doing what he did, because in watching what happened to him, it showed the young man that in fact, he did want to live. At 1 a.m. on March 3rd, 1944, a young train operator named Michel Palo stood in the caboose car of a freight train that was slowly going up the side of a mountain in southern Italy. Michel's job was to operate the brakes for the back half of the train. And tonight, he had to be on high alert because they were traveling under really dangerous conditions. In fact, Michel was worried they might not even make it to the next stop. So first of all, it was raining and snowing outside, so the tracks were naturally very slippery, which meant it was going to be harder for the train to get the traction it needed to go up the mountain. Second, the train's engine wasn't working as well as normal. And that was in large part because the coal the train company had to use was this really cheap, crappy kind of coal. Because this is 1944, World War II is raging, and a coal shortage had been created as a result of that, because all the good coal was being shipped off to be used in the war. And so, this train company had the bad coal. And then finally, the train was just way too heavy. Even though it was only supposed to be carrying the, small crew and the freight, the reality is there were over 500 stowaways on board weighing the train down. Again, this is World War II. There are all these people that are trying to flee war-torn parts of the world, and one of the ways they would do that is by stowing away on trains. And now Michel and the other crew, they were aware of these stowaways. It was not subtle. They're literally in the cars, they're on top of the cars, and they're just trying to make their way into Italy to get away from, war-torn parts of the world. And Michel and the other crew, they were supposed to call security and, tell these people to get off the train, but they didn't do that. They felt bad. And they sort of felt like, allowing these people to, make their escape was, a morally good thing to do. But tonight, between the horrible weather making the tracks slick and, the coal that was not very good and sort of made the engine not work very well, and all this additional weight from the stowaways, it just seemed to Michel like if there was ever going to be a time that this train could not make it up the mountain, it was going to be tonight. And so the reason he's on high alert is if the train reached a point where it could not go any higher for any of the reasons I've just told you, the train would start to backslide. And that's incredibly dangerous, and it would be on Michel and also the engineers at the front of the train to hit the brakes and stop the slide. And so Michel, he's on high alert, he's got the lever for the brakes, he's watching for any sign of the train slowing down, something like that. And they begin to make their ascent up this mountain up ahead. And at first, it's going relatively fine, but it was just very clear to Michel, who knew this train well, that it was struggling to get up the tracks. But he saw up ahead there was this tunnel they would have to pass through before they made the trip the rest of the way up and over the mountain. And Michel's thinking, great, the tunnel is going to provide us dry, clean tracks where the train, if we just get into that tunnel, we can sort of get some momentum, get through the tunnel and ride that momentum because we know the tracks are going to be good up and over the rest of the way. And so Michel he's anxiously watching as the train is sort of sputtering its way up towards this tunnel. He knows that's going to be the key. Just get to that tunnel and we'll be able to get over this mountain, no problem. And so up they go, inching their way, and he sees the front of the train goes into the tunnel, and right away he feels like the train's gaining a little bit of speed here as more and more of the train is getting onto those dry tracks in the tunnel, and they're moving right along, but then sort of inexplicably, the train begins to slow down as the train is, again, entering into this tunnel. Remember, it's late at night, he can't really see what's going on, he can just tell that there's the tunnel, the train's going in, but we're slowing down here. And in fact, by the time that the caboose, where Michel was about to enter into the train, the last car here, the train had finally slowed down so much that the train actually came to a stop with Michel and the caboose right outside the tunnel. So, 99% of the train is in the tunnel. Michel and the caboose are outside. The train is now fully stopped. Now, generally speaking, the conductor, who was situated in the very front car of the train, was overall in charge of the train. And so in any sort of emergency situation, it was often on the conductor to sort of make the call about what the crew was going to do in response. Now, the train was clearly not backsliding. There wasn't an active emergency here, but Michel knew that this is wrong. There really wasn't a clear reason they should be stopped here. If anything, again, this tunnel represented their best chance to move quickly and gain momentum and ride up and over this mountain. And so Michel does not know why they're stopped, but clearly there's some sort of issue. However, Michel knows from his training that what he needs to do is still be wary of the brake here, because for all he knows, maybe there is some issue with the train and it is backsliding, but it's just slow. And so he needs to be ready to hit the brakes. And so what Michel did is he held the brake and waited for a signal from the conductor. Basically, the conductor would blow a series of whistles that, Michel would be able to translate that would tell him what to do, whether it was, lock the brakes or come up and talk to me or any number of different things he might need to do in this situation. And so Michel, he's just sitting there waiting for the train whistle, but there's nothing. There's just quiet. There's no other sound except for the idling engine, towards the front of the train. And so Michel, he just started to have this bad feeling that this doesn't make sense. There's no good reason why we've stopped here. And so Michel, operating on gut instinct here, despite not getting any signal from the conductor, no whistles, no anything, he abandoned the caboose, he abandoned the brake station, and began walking from the caboose basically up the center of the train, going into the next car. And when he got into the next car, it's totally dark because it's 1 a.m. This car is the first car that he's walking into that's in the tunnel, so it's very dark. And he did have a flashlight, but he didn't want to shine it on the people who are sleeping in here because there's hundreds of stowaways. These people have had very bad luck. They just want to get out of the country. And so as quietly as he could, he's walking through the aisle of this next train car. And, he doesn't notice anything. Everybody is asleep for the most part. And he's walking along. And as he gets to the next train car, he realizes he's starting to hear a new sound. And it's not coming from in the train. It's coming from somewhere outside in the tunnel. It's like this loud thumping sound. Something is hitting the rocks on the side of the tracks somewhere in the tunnel. And, Michel, he doesn't know what it is. He still doesn't know what's going on. He hasn't discovered any sign of, what has actually happened here. And so he just keeps on walking. And as he goes into the next car, he continues to hear all these thumping sounds somewhere outside. And the train's still not moving. There's no whistles from the conductor. By the time he's about halfway down that next train car, he's now into the second car he's investigating. He realizes that in addition to the odd thumping sound and the lack of movement and lack of anything really going on in this tunnel, he also realizes that the car itself that he is in is very quiet. Remember, there's basically dozens of people in each of these cars kind of laying on each other, sleeping as they make their way into Italy. And so for the first time, Michel turned on his flashlight and he's aiming it at the ground right in front of him. And he turned and began to scan all the stowaways sleeping in this car. And what he saw was so horrifying, he dropped the flashlight, turned, and ran out of the tunnel. It would turn out Michel was right to be concerned that this train might not be able to make it up this mountain. By the time the train sputtered into that tunnel, despite the fact that yes, the conditions were much better in the tunnel for the train to maintain speed and momentum, despite that, the other factors were too much to overcome. The train was too heavy from all the stowaways, and the coal was quite bad, so the engine was not as powerful as it normally would be. And so even though the tracks were not slick, it was just too much. And so the train ground to a halt inside of the tunnel. And so what needed to happen as soon as the train came to a stop like that is the conductor and the crew at the front of the train, they needed to basically jumpstart the train. They needed to put as much coal as they could into the furnace to get this engine turning enough that it could pick up speed again and continue their journey. They basically needed to rev the engine, if you will, and really fire this engine up and get it going. But in order to do that, They had to put a huge amount of this coal into the furnace to make that jumpstart happen. Because again, this coal is not high quality. It doesn't burn as well, it's not as efficient. And so basically what could have been accomplished with 2 times the amount of coal, you needed like 10 times the amount of this bad coal to do the same thing. But one of the byproducts of burning this type of coal, really coal in general, but especially this cheap kind of coal, and especially this much of this cheap kind of coal, is it produces a ton of carbon monoxide. And that filled this tunnel. Michel was outside of the tunnel. His caboose was the one car that was not in the tunnel. But everybody else on this train was suddenly being exposed to a huge amount of poisonous, lethal gas. And it killed virtually everybody on this train very quickly. Those thumping sounds that Michel was hearing were the sounds of people's bodies after they had died rolling off the train and falling to the ground. When he walked through the train car and looked around, the reason it was so quiet is everybody in these train cars were dead. Out of the approximately 600 stowaways and crew who had been on board this train, 521 were found dead.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.